Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 61 Your best nightmares. Marnan sighed, trying her best to stand still. Her legs ached and her entire body thrummed with restless energy. It felt like she'd been stuck in her father's throne room, standing dutifully between her brothers, for days. "My lady, you're fidgeting again," Gorim murmured in her ear, and she turned enough to glare back at him, only to meet with his laughing eyes. The three siblings stood beside their father's throne, watching their father hold court, and watching the Deshers watch them, and her bodyguard and friend stood right behind her, as always, ready to guard and to chide as the situation required. Still, there was something off about his eyes. What was off about his eyes? Wordlessly, she turned her attention back forward, and she heard Gorim chuckle. She hated these functions, he knew that. Even worse when she wasn't allowed to attend them armed or in armor, as was the case now. No, this was a formal civil court. That meant she had to wear a dress like a proper lady of House Ejikin. The bodice itched, and she didn't like how her blasted skirt tangling around her legs when she moved. Worse, without the weight of a weapon on her back, she felt naked and vulnerable, though that was a strange anxiety, here in the safety of Orzammar. No one would dare touch King Endrin's beloved daughter in his own palace. She knew enough about politics to know that much. "To excuse Lady Helmi's conduct in the assembly, my king," one of the Deshers was saying. "It is unbecoming of anyone, least of all a woman of her reputation." "I will not stand for such slander," said Lady Shot back. "You will do well to recall, young man, who signed over the permit to your southern mines some years back. Only because you owed my father a debt, Lady Helmi. It was hardly a matter of honor. Even if that were true, it still speaks poorly of your own honor that you would denounce your business partner so." King Endrin nodded along to all of it, allowing the drama to unfold as he always did. He enjoyed the games the houses played, and encouraged his offspring to try their hands at it themselves. Marnan hated it. She always had. But she could not disobey her father thus. If he wanted her to stand in the throne room while he held court, then she would stand in the throne room while he held court. "Do try not to get too far behind, dear sister," Trian's voice hissed in her ear. "I know how anything more subtle than a proving bout confuses you." Her spine stiffened. "The provings are plenty subtle, in their way. Not that you'd know of that, having never fought in one. And why would I need to, when I have plenty of brave warriors who are honored to fight for me? A concept that you have never been able to grasp. Perhaps my warriors find honor in fighting beside me, rather than under me, Trian." "Brother, sister, this is not necessary," Belen's voice said smoothly from her other side. "We should be enjoying the opportunity to stand in on this, not digging up old arguments." Marnan sighed, because their little brother was right. Baiting Trian never did any good anyway. Despite the fact that he was the eldest and therefore the one traditionally voted heir, everyone liked Marnan better. That would be a sticking point between them until the day one of them died. Something in her heart tugged at that, but it fluttered away, taken by the mind-numbing drone of the Deshers delivering economic entreaties. And then, something new happened. One of the heralds scurried into the room, announcing that they had visitors. Endrin stood, and the 100 Deshers followed his example at the tables and benches throughout the hall. Marnan's eyes widened as, of all things, humans walked into the throne room. She had seen humans once or twice, in the occasional traders that ventured into the city. However, none would have been so bold as to interrupt the king's court, and the Deshers' disapproval was evident by the roll of whispers that echoed around the chamber. Leading the way was a man in Templar armor, and something in Marnan paused in confusion, because she should not know what a Templar was. When the guards by the door reached for his weapons, after all, one must remove one's weapons in the presence of the king as a sign of good faith. The blond man merely frowned and shooed the guards away empty-handed. Behind him were 3 women in robes, 2 in mage's robes and 1 in the uniform of a chantry sister, and it again occurred to her that she should not know what such things were. She frowned, confused. "Who are you, strangers," King Endrin said slowly, "that you come into my hall thus?" To Marnan's shock, the man completely ignored the king's question. His eyes roamed around the hall for a minute. Then, they landed right on her, and they widened a bit. "Marnan? Wow, I didn't even know you owned a He trailed off, obviously noting Marnin's confusion. Never mind. Let's just get out of here. And suddenly, it came to Marnin that she much preferred to be with these strangers than to stand in her father's court for the rest of eternity. She nodded and took a step off the dais. Let's go. Tension thrummed through the deshers and her father frowned at her. Daughter, what are you doing? She paused, though from respect for her father rather than uncertainty over her choice. Leaving. In the middle of royal court? How then, will you ever learn to hold it yourself, if you never stay for one all the way through? Marnin fought down her annoyance. Again, this was her father, she had to be respectful. I have stood here for long enough to get the gist, father. Now, I wish to leave. Traian growled, see, father, the contempt she holds for the throne and all it stands for. Oh sod off, you nug's hindquarters. Marnin. King Endrin rose to his full height, his mien regal, imposing, and not a little terrifying. No daughter of mine will disrespect the matters of the deshers in such a way. Whether you like it or not, daughter, this is where you belong, not out on the field with your warrior playmates. Marnin felt her face grow hot. Something in her quailed at having these humans present for this, but she was determined to hold her ground. Even against her father. You think you are grooming me for the throne, but I've never wanted it. It's Traian's by tradition, and we both know he wants it a great deal more than I. She turned to her elder brother, who glared back at her through narrowed eyes. You want it? It's yours. I will gladly abdicate any right to it. If you want to squabble over that demmed chair so badly, squabble with Belen. Daughter, you have a duty. Sod your duty. A rumble of disapproval went through the deshers. My duty is to my men. Those who live and die in the deep roads every day so that we can continue to exist. And if being an Ejican denies me the right to do so, then perhaps it is better that I no longer am one. She wasn't sure why she spoke that strange last line, but something in it rang achingly true. To the roars of the deshers, she turned and took another step toward where the humans waited, wide-eyed. However, the hiss of steel sounded behind her, and a cold metal blade pressed against the back of her neck. I am sorry, my lady, rumbled Gorham's voice. We cannot let you leave. Alarm bells were ringing in truth now in her head, because Gorham had always had her back. Slowly, she turned to look at him and she realized what was off in his eyes. In a flash, she realized that there was none of that which had prompted so much unwavering loyalty over the years, none of that silent yearning that she had long ago come to accept as a necessary part of his service. He had never said it out loud, of course, but she'd known. All her life, she'd known. And he'd never asked her whether she felt anything in return, because he already knew what her answer would be. And yet still, it was there, down all those years. Except not now, and that was when Marnin realized how wrong everything was. This whole thing was off. Her standing side by side with her brothers. Belen's neutral smile. The human strangers who she wanted more than anything to leave with and never come back. She frowned, grabbed Gorham's sword arm, and twisted it until he released the sword into her grip. Then, she punched him in the face. The throne room was suddenly filled with monstrous shrieks and growls as chaos broke loose. Deshers grew claws and fangs, just another day at court, and threw themselves on her and the humans alike. Now armed, if perhaps wearing less protective armor than she would have liked, she turned to meet her attackers and rammed each of them through as they came. She waded through the crowd, the deshers disappearing in puffs of smoke on her blade. She took blow after blow from the creatures, but a few bruises were nothing, especially when she felt a rush of healing magic go through her, and she swiftly retaliated and smashed through the shades in turn. Most of the desher demons were weak enough that they poofed apart after one blow. Soon, she found herself back to back with the blonde man. Alistair, she recalled. I'm sorry to say, Marnin, the man said through a grin as he swept a pair of the creatures aside with his shield, that you can't really pull off the docile lady of court look. You, on the other hand, she rejoined, make a quite convincing Templar. Is there something you've neglected to mention, Alistair? Why yes, actually. I've been a Chantry spy this entire time. Leliana and I are going to convert all you heathens to the faith, and then bring Morrigan in for apostasy. Oh, and we'll probably also lead an exalted march at some point, haven't decided what against, though. Marnan sliced the head off a guard, memories returning to her with each swing of her stolen sword. The wardens. The circle tower. Belen. Marnan cast around through the carnage for the demon who had been unfortunate enough to pick that form. The fake Trian was carving his way through the crowd toward Alistair with his maul, while the false father disappeared in a puff of smoke with an arrow through his throat even as Marnan noticed him. But then, she spotted Belen, and the demon who wore his face got one thing right: this Belen was staying back from the fighting, obviously waiting for the opportune moment to make his move. It was so like the Belen who had betrayed both her and Trian that Marnan felt rage unlike any other spike through her. She shoved through the line of clawing Desher demons, cleaving a path with her sword straight toward the likeness of her treacherous younger brother. A claw bit deep into her shoulder, but she ignored the pain and kept toward him. She remembered when he'd fallen into that deep stalker pit when they were kids. He'd cried for days after that. She remembered when he'd talked Trian and her into sneaking into Dust Town. Just to see it. The guards had been forced to intervene, but their younger brother had been so thrilled that they couldn't stay mad at him. She remembered a dozen times that she and Trian would have torn one another apart, either by words or with hands, had Belen not stepped in and cooled both their heads. But most of all, she remembered Belen looking her in the eye and smiling as he condemned her to death in the deep roads. The false Belen drew his sword and shield as Marnan approached, but she was not deterred by any demon's stolen skills. She knocked the weapon and shield out of its amateur grip and reached forward with her free hand. Gripping his chest plate, she lifted him onto his toes. "You picked the wrong dwarf to impersonate, demon," she growled, and plunged her sword deep into the simulacrum of her brother's heart. It was over far too quickly. Belen dissipated, and then so did the other Deshers, and the very walls around her. She was left on a desolate, cracked landscape with the others staring at her. And by the ancestors, she was still wearing that stone-awful dress. She sighed and turned to fully face her companions, reading the shock and awe in their eyes. She would not lose her courage, not now. "I suspect that I owe you an explanation. You're a child of King Endrin of Orzammer, aren't you?" Leliana breathed. "You're a princess." Marnan winced and snapped her no. A bit too harshly. Calming herself, she walked over to the humans. "No," she said a bit more gently. "I was a princess. But my brother Belen betrayed both myself and my elder brother Trian, and I was stripped of my title and exiled as a result. Now, I'm a Grey Warden, nothing more or less." Leliana still looked like she'd found a particularly delicious piece of chocolate. Felicity, too, regarded her with bright, curious eyes, and Marnan guessed it was only a matter of time before the intrusive questions flowed out of her. At least she was holding her tongue, for now. Wynne, at least, regarded Marnan with solemn sympathy. An expression that was matched, oddly enough, by Alistair. "Andrastas Knickers," the ex-Templar breathed, shaking his head. "Garot's nickname. I thought it was sarcastic, but he knew all along, didn't he?" She nodded. "I don't know why he never let it slip. He certainly had plenty of opportunities. Maybe he figured it wasn't his secret to tell." Marnan could only shrug helplessly to that. "Is it true that the dwarves vote on their kings?" Felicity burst out, seeming unable to contain it anymore. Marnan sighed. "Is that the reason for the hostility we witnessed with your elder brother? He was afraid that, if it came down to a vote, you'd receive more than him? And those were the Deshers, weren't they, the ones who would have voted? I thought most of their meetings were done in an assembly hall, not in a king's throne room. Just how symbolic is the king, anyway? What kinds of powers does he hold over the nobility?" "Felicity," Alistair said gently, "enough." And, to Marnan's shock, the mage fell quiet. The dwarf turned a startled look at Alistair, who was displaying a rather unexpected amount of sympathy. No wisecracks or indignant sputtering at having been lied to. "You're taking this quite well," she observed carefully. He ran a hand through his hair nervously. "Let's just say, there's something I should probably tell you guys. When this is all over." Marnan nodded, and Felicity started leading them through the landscape. After a couple minutes of walking, they found a round portal and stepped through. There was a rundown mage waiting for them on the other side, huddled over a glowing book. He offered them a tired smile. "You're getting faster at that." "I should hope so, Niall," said Win. "We certainly have little time to spare." Felicity asked him, "Any sign of the sloth demon yet?" Niall shook his head. "No. I don't know what he's doing. There haven't been any new dreamers since you came, and he doesn't seem to be resisting your release of them all that hard." "I suspect that we will find out one way or another soon," said Win. Felicity moved over to Niall's side and peered over at the book. "This last one must be Percival, then." "Which begs the question," Marnan cut in, looking at Alistair. "Just what are you and Percival doing here anyway? Should you not be at Redcliffe, trying to cure our leman?" "We ran into a bit of a snag," Alistair hedged. "Seems our dear circle mages aren't the only ones getting possessed by demons these days." "Oh dear," Win sighed. "We may have a bit more trouble with Percival," Felicity broke in as she and Niall wove some sort of spell over the book. "There's a reason I kept this vertex until last. It's centralized, and there seems to be a great deal more entropic energy flowing from it than the others." "Meaning?" Alistair prodded. "Meaning that whatever dream the demon put him in, he wants to stay there. Very, very badly." No one had the heart to respond to that. They may not have known the details, but it was obvious some sort of tragedy had occurred in the nobleman's past. It seemed they would soon learn a great deal about the manner of that tragedy. Marnan gripped her sword how she wished she had her axe and followed Felicity and Alistair through the glowing portal. They emerged into a sun-filled courtyard. The grass underfoot was surprisingly soft, and lush greenery surrounded them. Creatures that Marnan understood were called birds perched in the trees above them, singing. Even the stone walls surrounding the courtyard were lined with vines and flower-colored trellises. It was all a sharp contrast to the nightmarish wasteland they had just left. Across the courtyard was a practice pitch occupied by a dozen people. Men and women, old and young, milled around the pitch while a pair of men sparred. One of those men, dressed in little more than cotton breeches, was Percival, and he was laughing. It wasn't the dark laughter that she'd seen him occasionally partake in, nor even a lighter chuckle. These were the full-blown belly laughs of one who was thoroughly enjoying life, passionately and without reservation, even as he parried and riposted against the other man's blade. Marnan had never thought that Percival Cowsland could laugh like that. Leliana made a sad sound. "He looks so happy, doesn't he?" "Remember, this is all the sloth demon's trick," Felicity said uncertainly. "We are doing him no favors by allowing this to continue." "It is likely as you observed, Felicity," Win said. "This is the scenario with the most entropic energy because the dreamer will genuinely not want to leave." Alistair sighed. "I, for one, can't wait to see how he reacts when we try to wake him up. Anyone want to take bets on whose head he tries to cut off first?" "It may not be pleasant," Marnan said. "But it must be done." She started toward the pitch, and the others fell into step behind her. She could see the gathered humans a bit better now. Percival and the young, dark-haired man he was sparring with, also shirtless, were centralized. Watching them from off the pitch were a pair of women, one older and one younger, and an older man. The man grinned and shouted teasing encouragement at the fighters while the elder woman alternated between scolding him for slips of the tongue and joining in the heckling herself. The younger woman, meanwhile, winced every time the dark-haired man got hit. There were a handful of armored men on the other side of the pitch, also watching and laughing. Near them, a boy played with a practice sword, obviously mimicking the elder men. An elderly woman kept an eye on the boy with a sour expression, muttering to herself while she took a paring knife to a pile of potatoes. Farther back, against the wall, was a gaggle of female admirers, whispering among themselves and watching the fighters with hungry eyes. What in the ancestor's name would possess Percy to dream that? It took a moment for Marnan to spot Hugo. The dog was off to one side of the pitch, alternating between growling at anyone who got too close and whining anxiously in Percival's direction. Could it be that Hugo was genuine? "Only more proof," Alistair said, following her gaze, "that Hugo's smarter than the rest of us." At hearing his name, the Maberry's head swiveled around. He barked and bounded over, sitting in front of them with a whine. "Ah, poor puppy," Alistair said with a small smile. "Don't worry, We'll slay those nasty demons for you. Hugo barked, his tail wagging. Well, of course you can join in. Hugo stood and bounded around them, as if urging them on. Wynne gave Alistair a quizzical look. Are you honestly having a conversation with a dog? In my defense, the dog converses back. Leliana giggled. It seemed the dog's barking had drawn some attention, because the boy came running over. Hugo's hackles went back up, and he turned to rumble a menacing growl at the child. Hugo! What are you doing over here? The child turned wide eyes up at them, and Marnan almost believed the innocence there. Who are you people? Are you friends of my grandfather's? Oh, do stop this charade, demon, Wynne sighed. It befits none of us. What? What's a charade? Is that a kind of wine? My Uncle Percy likes wine, but he says it's better when it's shared with a close friend. I tell him I'm his close friend, but he just laughs and says I'm far too young for that. And that you are, Oren. Came a voice, and, for a moment, Marnan didn't recognize it. The cultured accent was the same, but Percy's voice had never held such energy. The blonde nobleman came up behind the boy and ruffled his hair fondly. Too young for both wine and close friendship. At least close friendship as Percy defines it. Percival's sparring partner laughed. He had his sword slung across one shoulder. Both men were sweating and breathing hard, but had the exhilarated glow of exercise that Marnan was rather familiar with herself. Percy turned his smile to them, and Marnan caught her breath despite herself. Percy was actually quite handsome. She'd never realized it before, because the gloom and bitterness that accompanied him everywhere was ugly in itself. But now, his features were finely carved and golden, and his bare torso showed off an athletic, warrior's physique that any warrior down in Orzammar would have envied. Welcome, my friends, Percy said warmly. I have to say this is a pleasant surprise. He cast his gaze around them, finally resting on Marnan herself. There was a strangely enticing glint in his eyes as he bent down and took her hand. I must say, Marnan, you are quite the stunning woman without all that steel plate masking your beauty. And, much to her shock, he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it. Then, he winked. Caught between being outraged, embarrassed, and flattered, words completely fled her. Did he just do that? Alistair whispered, apparently just as shocked. Percy, do you know who we are? Felicity asked carefully. Of course I do. Percy dropped Marnan's hand and stood up straight again. I can't say I ever expected to see you here in Highever, but it's good to see you nonetheless. Come, you can meet my family. He waved at the crowd behind him. Most of their eyes were now trained on the newcomers. Your family? Leliana asked weakly. The dark-haired man laughed. Come, brother. Introduce us. Or have you now forsaken all propriety and manners altogether? Only in matters where it doesn't suit me, Percy rejoined. To the wardens, he said, this ugly lout is my brother, Fergus. Fergus barked a laugh and swiped at the blond man. And this skimp is his son, Oren. Again, Percy's hand ruffled the boy's hair. Hugo once had louts, the boy said sagely. We had to bathe him in special soap sent in from Orlais to kill them all. That's lice, Oren, his father corrected with a laugh. You don't still have lice, right boy? The boy asked the dog, stepping closer. Hugo barked and snapped at the child, and only his father's timely grip on his shoulder yanked him back. Hugo. Percy said sharply. Bad dog. Really, what's gotten into you? Hugo whined, head low, and hunkered down beside Alistair. Is everything all right, pup? This was the old man. He and the two noble women were within speaking range now. The younger woman quickly gathered the boy protectively into her arms. Percy frowned at his dog. Something's wrong with Hugo. His stomach is probably just upset, the older woman tooted. Small surprise, with what you let him get into. Mother. Oh, hush. I don't believe for a second that him tearing up Lady Elia's dressing room was an accident. Some of those cosmetics were likely toxic, you know. You only have yourself to blame. The older man laughed. Still, that one was damn creative of you, pup. Getting into her skirts by having your dog rip up all her skirts. Bryce. Don't encourage him. All I mean, Eleanor, the man chuckled, is that if he devoted that much thought and creativity to everything else, we would soon be the proud parents of the ruler of all Thetis. Father, Percival groaned fondly. Marnan couldn't find the heart to interrupt such a domestic scene. And, looking back at the others, Leliana was near tears. They couldn't either. Percy was happy, for the first time that she had ever seen him, well and truly content. This isn't right, Alistair managed thickly. Percy, you must feel that this isn't right. What isn't? The young noble asked a bit too quickly. That's ridiculous, Alistair. You've obviously been hit in the head one too many times. He turned sharply and walked back to the pitch, his family turning to follow. The wardens and their companions exchanged looks among themselves. This is going to be more difficult than I'd thought, Felicity sighed. How can we convince him to leave, Leliana asked, if he refuses to disbelieve? Perhaps we should simply begin taking out the demons without his permission, Marnan suggested. They all stared at her wide-eyed. Marnan. Alistair said. You know Percy, right? You've met? Because if we even attempt to attack one of those creatures, he's going to go into one of his rages and use us for sword practice. Not to mention, Wynne said softly, such actions would obviously break the boy's heart. Agreed, Felicity said. We must somehow convince Percival to remember on his own. She glanced down at Hugo, who quirked an ear up at her hopefully. Perhaps if we can convince one of the demons to reveal itself, it will be enough to snap him out of it. Alistair's face brightened. Felicity, that's brilliant. He'd never heard Hugo, even in a dream. Felicity reddened and nodded. A demon would defend itself. She looked across the courtyard. Hugo, go for one of the women in the corner. They're unarmed and thus will be forced to manifest something, but they're not as emotionally charged as his family members. Hugo barked, tail wagging, and sped across the yard. Growling, the hound barreled into the women, sending them scattering, shrieking. Hugo! Percy's voice cried. He broke away from his family to chase the dog. Hugo, heel! The hound ignored his master's commands, chasing one of the young women halfway across the yard before he caught her and barreled her to the ground. Sure enough, as he tore into her, her fingers elongated into claws, which dug into the dog's neck. Hugo howled in pain. Percival stopped about 10 feet from the scuffle, staring in obvious confusion. Leliana leapt forward and tackled another of the women as she came near them, and this one wasted no time in hissing a curse and freezing the bard where she lay. Marnan stepped up and kicked the creature away, before it could hurt her companion. Her feet promptly got tangled in her skirts, and she growled and used her sword to cut the damn things off at the knee. But, what? Percy's voice was thick, torn. What's going on? It's a dream, Percy, Felicity said in her most reasonable tone, even as she cast a dispelling spell on Leliana. You're under the spell of the sloth demon. No, that can't be. Something haunted flashed through his eyes, before he turned an angry gaze on them. Maybe you're the trick. You're trying to confuse me with these illusions. You know that's not true, Felicity pleaded. Lies. Percy pointed his sword toward them. Leave now, demons. I won't tolerate you hurting my family. You'd best do as he says, a silky, sibilant voice said, and Marnan shuddered to realize that it was coming from the child, Oren. He's ours, and he will fight to protect us. Even if it means killing all of you. Percy didn't seem to even hear the demonic voice. Percy. Alistair said, his voice breaking. Percy, you've got no family to protect. They're dead. You know this. Lies. Familiar rage flared in the man's eyes, and he leapt forward at them. Alistair stepped up to meet him, blocking each furious blow with sword and shield but not striking back. Fight it, Percy. You're letting the demon win. The only demons I see here are you, the nobleman growled, and smashed a particularly vicious blow into Alistair's guard. The Templar grunted and stumbled back a step. With alarm, Marnan noted that the rest of the family was circling around them, obviously anticipating a fight, but none making any moves yet. Most had manifested weapons, even the older woman with the paring knife looked demonic and deadly. So much for ending this peacefully, Wen sighed, and cast a spell that threw a stone fist into the cluster of guardsmen. Marnan didn't waste any time springing into action. She followed that fist to the downed guardsmen, using their stunned states to stab one with her sword and then take his maul out of his hands. Much more satisfied now that she had a decently heavy weapon to bear, she brought the maul around to crush in the spine of another demonic guard. It disappeared with a blast of smoke. The battle was joined, now, though it was dangerously precarious. Marnan had no armor, so her dress tattered away under blow after blow. At least she had 2 healers behind her, because that was the only thing that kept her on her feet. Leliana wasn't much better than Marnan in her chantry robes. But at least she'd gotten a bow from somewhere, and wasted no time in returning fire to the demon in Percy's mother's form. No. Percy howled, breaking away from Alistair to charge at Leliana. Marnan was too caught in trying to smack a knight into oblivion to get there in time. Fortunately, Hugo met him halfway, barreling into the nobleman and pinning him to the ground with his bulk. Percy struggled viciously, but Hugo just whined and pressed the man into the dirt. With every demon that dissolved into a cloud of smoke, his struggles became more half-hearted, as if the reality of the situation was finally winning out. At about the time that Marnan smashed the childlike demon's head in, demon or not, that image would follow her forever. Percival fell limp and silent. Hugo whined again. Finally, the last of the demons were vanquished, and the sunny courtyard around them began to dissolve back into the twisted landscape of the Fade. Marnan's dress was in tatters, but at least she wouldn't have to wear the thing for much longer. Percy. Felicity's voice said hesitantly. Marnan turned to see the others circling around the nobleman. Percy, can you hear me? Hugo, get off him, Alistair grunted, and Dog obediently lifted from off his master's back. Marnan joined the circle around the noble, and she immediately saw why the others were so concerned. Percival remained where he'd fallen, motionless. He didn't acknowledge any of them. Instead, his eyes were clouded and distant. Mad, a part of her squeaked and filled with such consuming despair that Marnan almost regretted what they'd just done. He's in shock, Wen said gently. It's not uncommon, after a traumatic experience. Alistair knelt down next to the other man, hesitantly reaching a hand out to touch his shoulder. Percy blinked. Percy, you have to snap out of it. We've got a demon to kill, and then another demon to kill. And then, when we get to Red Cliff, another demon to kill. That sounds like fun, doesn't it? Percival let out something like a whimper, but at least that was a response. Marnan settled at the noble's other side. She and Alistair pulled Percival up into a sitting position. Percy blinked, his eyes still clouded, but he seemed to register their presence. Kill me, he whispered, and Marnan's heart stuttered, certain that she'd heard that wrong. What? Felicity said, leaning over them. What did he just say? Kill me, and now it was more of a growl. Please. I can't. His voice cracked, and a sob racked through him. I can't lose them. Not again. Please, please just kill me. More dry sobs shuddered through his form, and Marnan could only hold on to him while he crumpled. Alistair's worried eyes met hers. You did not think it would be so easy, mortals. The sloth demon's voice spoke up. It formed about 20 feet from them, all sharp angles and darkness. That I would let you roam my realm, tearing down these dreams I put so much work into constructing? I made you happy, and you went and knocked down my gift like spiteful children. Percival's form racked again, and the sloth demon groaned in something that almost sounded like pleasure. It's feeding off this young man's despair. Wen's voice sounded horrified. Indeed, the demon purred. Such a font I've found, in this one. So eager for nothing more than that everything stay the same. No progress. No future. Only the still, unchanging past. The demon glided closer, and Percy keened as it neared, his body drooping. And now that you've shattered that, oh, his anguish is a banquet before me. Such hopelessness. Such despondency. Leliana raised her bow, standing protectively over them. We won't let you take him, demon. Marnan was surprised to hear such a hard voice out of the bard. The sloth demon chuckled, and it was the oiliest sound she'd ever heard. Foolish mortal, he is already mine. Percy slumped in Marnin's arms, weeping, and even the dwarf could see the dark magic emanating from the nobleman. Skin-crawling shrieks pierced the air, and 5 creatures appeared in a circle around them. Marnin and Alistair both stood and drew their weapons, and Percy fell limply to the ground at their feet. "You guard him," Alistair said to her. "I'll take Ugly over there." Marnin nodded, standing over the noble's shuddering form and raising her maul to the monsters around them. Her companions followed suit, circling around their comrade's prone figure. The demonic summons closed in. The gaunt, twisted form of an abomination threw itself at Felicity. Meanwhile, Leliana kept interrupting one Desire Demon's spells with a constant stream of arrows, while a second Desire Demon circled Wynne, cackling. It was the ogre-like demon that leapt straight for Marnin, and it was all she could do to keep the hulking creature from tearing her to shreds. She was hardly inexperienced with such creatures, but that did not make the fight easy. She met one swing of its powerful fists with her maul, jarring her already aching shoulders, and then slammed her weapon into the monster's knee. It stumbled back. It might have been a victory, had the last monster, a rage demon, not come around behind her and lunged for Percival. She swept her maul around to meet it, batting it away and placing herself as a shield between it and its prey. The rage demon roared and spat fire, and she stood her ground, feeling her skin char under the onslaught. She didn't have time to retaliate, because the ogre was nearly on top of her, roaring in triumph as it raised its arms to deliver the killing blow. She turned back around and slammed the pummel of her maul into its gut, then swept the weapon low to take out the ogre at the knees. It toppled. The rage demon slammed into her back, and she stumbled forward. It again lunged at Percival, but she caught it with her maul and turned it aside. It stumbled away, and she stepped in and swung the hammer up into its belly. It toppled backwards, and she raised her hammer and slammed it into its head in a final, killing blow. Concerned, she turned her attention back to the ogre, only to see it stumbling to the side, 3 arrows protruding from its neck. A 4th hit into it in the side of the head, and it disappeared with a roar. Leliana smirked. "I said you wouldn't win, demons." Marnin nodded her thanks and turned her attention to the others. Wynne seemed to have shaken off her Desire Demon with Hugo's help. Now, the Elder Mage was concentrating on healing Alistair, who was getting shoved around by the Sloth Demon something awful. Felicity, however, was hunkered in a magical shield while the abomination tore at the invisible wall between them. Each blow made the mage flinch, and Marnin wondered how much such a shield was sapping her. Marnin wasted no time stepping in to meet the abomination, even as Leliana's arrows soared past her to collide into it. A moment later, her maul took the creature through the chest, and it disappeared. Felicity smiled at them, drooping as the shield dissipated. "Thank you. I fear I'm rather hopeless in single combat." Marnin shrugged. "You're a healer. If you're in single combat, I'm not doing my job." The burns on her face made it sting to talk, but it was ignorable. She swung the maul up onto her sore shoulder, and turned to face the sloth demon. It was running Alistair ragged, now, and Marnin was rather impressed that the ex-Templar had lasted so long alone against it. The sloth demon kept raising his arms in spell casting, but Alistair was quick to leap in with a particularly vicious attack as soon as it began. Templar training, in this case, proved quite beneficial. Wynne seemed to be quickly tiring, behind her constant stream of healing magic. "Felicity," Marnin said, "can we kill that thing in here?" The mage hummed and thought. "Theoretically, yes. This being its realm, it may be more difficult than merely damaging it, but it would hardly be invulnerable. What happens if we kill it? We should be ejected, once its hold on us is broken." She paused thoughtfully. "Either that, or the realm would collapse and we'd be spat deeper into the Fade, stranded and doomed to wander the dream realm for the rest of eternity." "That is, not very comforting," Leliana said. "Perhaps it isn't comforting," Wynne said tiredly. "But we do not have much of a choice either way." "Agreed," Marnin said. "Hugo, guard your boy. Ladies, cover me." The mages and bard nodded, and Marnin hefted her maul and attacked. Alistair stumbled back from a vicious blow and took a blast of cold for it. Marnin was on the creature a moment later, swinging the maul into its back. The weapon seemed to pass right through the demon's form with only some resistance, as if it were passing through gel. It turned ponderously to her and raised its arm to cast at her, and she ducked to avoid a wintry blast of her own. Alistair's sword darted in, slashing into its stomach. His weapon, too, did not seem to do much damage, passing through the form as if through a ghost. Incorporeality. Felicity gasped, and Marnan didn't have the time to ask what in the ancestor's name that word meant. It's not entirely manifested, to protect itself from us. Always figured a sloth demon would cheat, Alistair panted drilly between swings. Marnan got sideswiped by one of its arms and stumbled back. Feels manifested enough to me. It's fading in and out. Felicity called. We need to find a way to keep it here. Allow me to help with that, said Niall's voice, and the demon began to glow and shimmer. It stopped fighting and turned its ponderous gaze on Niall, and so Marnan did too. The mage was heading toward them from a portal up a nearby hill, the large book from before clasped open in his hands. He muttered to himself, and each word seemed to strengthen the glow around the demon. You expend so much effort, human, the demon cooed at him, and Niall's eyes squinted in resistance of whatever the demon was doing to him. Wouldn't you prefer to rest? Do it, quickly, Niall gasped. I can't hold it for long. Alistair was the first to move, stepping forward and plunging his sword into the demon's back, and it shrieked in earnest as the blow finally did some damage. Marnan followed suit with her maul, taking out its legs. It toppled, and Alistair made short work of it with a slice across its throat. Niall collapsed and then the world around them wavered nauseatingly. Marnan felt like her footing was slipping, even though her feet were solidly planted. The wasteland of the Fade turned to white nothingness, and Marnan knew no more. 62 Desires deal. The first time she had disappeared, he'd been confused. The second time, he'd been annoyed. Now, he was just plain furious. Khazar planted himself in the middle of the Fade Island, letting magical fire crawl up his arms in clear threat. Come out, demon, or I burn this entire place down, and take the kid with it. As you wish, little mage, cooed the creature's sultry voice. The desire demon appeared in front of him in a rush of smoke, a pout on her face. You're no fun. Fun? Maybe I was unclear about how this works the first 3 times. I fight you. You die. No more of this blasted poofing to a different spot when I'm about to deliver the killing blow. Must it really be so? She sighed. The fingers of one hand idly ran down her bare breast. There are so many more pleasant ways to handle this confrontation, don't you think? He forced his eyes back up to her face, and scowled, insulted. Is everything about sex, with you creatures? Not carnal pleasures, then? The desire demon glided past him, her hand brushing his cheek as she passed. He jerked back and spun, not wanting to lose sight of her again. Not after chasing her halfway across the Fade Island. 3 times. Certainly, there are other things you desire. Things that may be in my power to grant. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes digging deep into his psyche. Then, her sultry smile turned sly. Yes, I see that there is one thing. If you think you can extort me dash. She laughed, a musical sound. Extortion? Such a strange word when faced with desire. She glided up close enough that he could smell the brimstone of her skin, and he hurriedly stepped back. No, what I propose is an exchange. Something I desire more than anything, for something you desire more than anything. He should blast her now. He really should just throw out a lightning bolt and be done with this whole ordeal. The others were waiting for him. Power, little mage, she whispered, reaching forward to wrap a talon-like hand around his chin. And all the freedom and joy that comes with it. You crave it. You burn for it. The words twisted inside him, wrapping around him like a spell. But it wasn't a spell. He swallowed. I can give you such power, more than you've ever dreamed. No one will dare to challenge you. No one will ever again tell you what to do. No one will ever be able to do as he did. One of her hands schemed his throat. He shuddered, but he was too entranced to think about pulling away. She stepped behind him and whispered into his ear with a voice like nectar, would it not be utterly delectable, to return and ensure his demise by the very same magic he once used to control you. Blood magic, Khazar breathed, though there didn't seem to be enough air. All he smelled was brimstone. You're offering to teach me blood magic. She pressed against his back, running her hands leisurely up his sides. A ripple of goosebumps followed in her hands' wakes. If your incompetent friend is made so powerful through the art as to send other mages into the fate and knock Templars unconscious, then imagine what you, the most talented mage of your generation, will become. Her hand caressed his face, and he found himself pressing into the touch. Unstoppable, he whispered, and he sounded possessed, even to himself. He tried to shake her off and gather his wits, but the demon's words made his heart patter and his head spin. No, this is a trick. You're trying to possess me. If only, her voice cooed in his ear. Her grip loosened, and she came around in front of him again, her eyes appreciative. A mage of your power and beauty would certainly bring delicious results. But no, a pride demon has already staked a future claim on your soul, and I am in no position to fight him. Keep your wits about you, mage. True tests never end. Mouse. But even a greater pride demon would be no match for you, the demon purred, were you to take me up on my offer. Khazar's wits seemed to be returning, though he still shivered with the rush of power lust she'd invoked. What do you take me for? You think I'd sell my soul for power? His mouth was dry, though, and his voice had an uncertain quaver in it. Not yours, she said. The boys. No deal. The words were not nearly as forceful as they should have been. Why so hasty? She cooed, unperturbed, and began circling him again. Think of what you're giving up. What you desire, more than anything, is to be seen as the great asset that you are. You wish for nothing more than the opportunity and tools to defeat your foes, which as a Grey Warden, happens to involve this blight. Do you not owe it to your order, Grey Warden, to take a tool of such utility as the one I offer? When it means that, should your companions fall, you will have the strength to destroy an entire horde. Is that not worth more than one child? He was slipping. He could feel his will scrabbling for purchase, as if the floor were tilting and there was nothing to hold on to. And what would you demand in return? The kid. Eventually, yes. She pouted. I can see that you would have no interest in my offer were I to continue as I have been. Your companions would immediately notice something amiss. But we spirits can be very patient. You're saying you'd leave Connor and come back later? Yes. Long after your blight is finished? Long past the point when anyone would suspect you. You leave me with my life today, and vow not to interfere when I finally do claim my host, and you will have all the power you have ever desired. Once again, her words were intoxicating, but more from the promise in them than any actual spell. He took a shaky breath. The others would never forgive me. They need not know. Her smile was enticing, and he found himself taking a step closer to her. Power. Unlike anything he'd ever imagined. He'd be able to move mountains, to call storms upon anyone who stood against him. No one would be able to use him like a puppet, a doll. All he had to do was sign away the soul of some dumb kid who had dealt with a demon to save his father's life. They needed power, didn't they? They needed every advantage to stop the blight. No one else but him could provide this sort of firepower, so didn't he have a responsibility to take it? Khazar licked his lips, and he felt the demon's claws twining through his hair. He leaned his head back into the touch. You will be free, she whispered, her breath hot against his throat. The most powerful mage in the world. Her hands tugged, and a throaty groan escaped him. Unstoppable. Yes, he gasped breathlessly. I accept, yes. Teach me. Her chuckle was molten against his throat, and he shivered in something that he could only assume felt like lust. Her talons glided down to caress his cheeks, guiding his face forward so that he looked into her deep, ageless eyes. She smiled and Khazar could see all his old dreams and secret yearnings fulfilled in her gaze. I knew there was a way this could end pleasurably, she purred, and leaned in to press their lips together. 63 strength of willpower. Percy felt empty. Like a vessel that had been completely drained. No anger. No sadness. No pain. Just nothing. He was too tired to feel. The ceiling above him was high. Windows lined the top of the wall, revealing a starry night sky beyond. The air smelled of corruption and filth. Something cold touched his ear, and he turned to see Hugo nuzzling into him. The hound whined and licked his nose. The man reached a hand up and stroked the dog's muzzle. "Percy? Are you all right?" He turned his head to see Felicity pulling herself to her feet nearby, watching him with concern. Next to her sat Alistair, rubbing his head and getting his bearings. He turned back to the ceiling, pondering the healer's question. Was he all right? Just what was all right anyway? He wasn't all right. He hadn't been all right for a long time. Ever since, however, he'd been a mess. In his depression, he'd been a burden. In his anger, he'd been a risk. And now, his soul had been used to sustain a demon against his fellow wardens, because he'd been too weak to turn his back on the obvious illusions. He couldn't let that happen again. He had to pull himself together. They were dead, and he had a new life now. He had a duty to the people of Ferelden, and he couldn't perform it while living in the past. He had to do as Garrod had said so long ago, and get over it. Oh goody. Alistair's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. He's back to his strong silent type act. I'm thinking, Percy said. He sat up, one hand running idly through Hugo's fur. Felicity knelt in front of him and reached out a hand to feel his forehead. He winced at the touch, but allowed it. You seem to be well enough. Are you feeling any after effects? He shrugged. Just tired. So does this mean we're done? Alistair asked. He walked over to the spot the sloth demon had been standing before it had sent them to the Fade. We killed the demon? We can actually get on with it now. Yes, Alistair, Felicity said with a small smile, standing. We can get on with it now. Percy pushed himself to his feet, feeling an unnerving calm settle over him. He hadn't felt calm since, before everything had happened. Was this what resolution felt like? It wouldn't be easy, but perhaps a bit of focus was what he needed. Maybe it's time we all get on with it, he muttered, invoking curious looks from the pair. He didn't offer an explanation, and they didn't ask. Alistair cautiously stepped out of the little room they'd attempted the ritual in. His sword raised, the ex-Templar walked down the corridor and peeked through the open door into the floor's central chamber. He jerked back with a yelp as Leliana turned out of the doorway at the same time. The bard laughed. Maker, Leliana. Don't sneak up on me. I almost lopped your head off. Don't worry, I would have ducked. I may be able to sneak, but you are louder than a bear wearing bells, no. Yes, well, you try walking around quietly with metal plates strapped to your legs. Alistair pouted, and both women laughed. Percival shouldered past them and stepped into the chamber, noting the gummy patches of corrupted slime covering the walls and floor. This might have been their tomb, had the others been as weak-minded as him. Never again, he resolved. Marnan and the old woman from his dream knelt next to another, prone figure. He stopped, startled to see the old woman out of the Fade. He'd thought she was a part of it, but apparently not. He didn't recognize the robed figure they knelt over at all. Whatever was going on there, the old woman didn't look happy about it. Her head was bowed, and she and Marnan both wore grim expressions. Hugo sniffed the air, his hackles up. Still, he stayed quiet and close to Percy's side, as loyal and protective as ever. It made the noble insanely grateful for his hound, and he resolved never to doubt the Maberry's instincts again. Felicity and Alistair came through the door behind him, the pair keeping a rather conspicuous distance from one another. Felicity immediately cried out and ran to the prone form. Oh no! What happened? The old woman shook her head grimly, cradling the man's head. He's gone. Oh, Niall. After he worked so hard to save us, too. Percy remembered the prone figure now, though vaguely through the haze of that last battle. This man had done something. He couldn't really remember. And it had cost the man his life. Again, something that wouldn't have been necessary if Percy had just been strong enough to resist the demon. Rage spiked through him, and he stifled his frustrated growl before it could leave his throat. Just one more way his weaknesses had caused harm. Hugo quirked his head up at him in concern, and Percy patted his hound's head. Then, he stepped forward to watch the room's other exit while the rest fussed over the corpse. It must have been hard, Leliana's voice said softly. She moved to stand next to Percy, her eyes searching his face. To lose all that. He grit his teeth against the rush of pain, and cut it off abruptly before it could get to him. They were gone. He had a new life. Are you looking for a confession, sister? It helps to talk, sometimes. Not in this, it doesn't. This is best left forgotten. Surely, you can't mean that. Our memories are what make us who we are. Perhaps that is the problem, he said softly. He could hear the others moving up behind them, and he didn't want them to hear. She got the point. Her eyes widened, but she closed her mouth and didn't press any further. He turned to the approaching group. Are we ready to move on? They nodded. The old woman said, we need to find First Enchanter Irving. If he is not here, then the last place he could be is above us, in the harrowing chamber. Although I'd like to stay a bit longer and talk about Marnan, Alistair teased. Specifically, Marnan in a dress. Why, just a couple jewels and you would have been quite the beautiful princess. Marnan looked at him flatly, though her eyes carried some mirth. I have my axe back, you know. Right. Shutting up. Still, Leliana giggled. The look on your face when Percival kissed your hand. One would think you'd never been greeted like that before. That is because I had not. Any man who would have dared back in Orzammar knew my reputation well enough to know I would have punched him in the face for trying. You had a reputation? Percy asked. She's a princess. Leliana. When chided. That is not your secret to tell. Everyone glanced at Percy, because he was apparently the only one who didn't already know. He shrugged. I'm supposed to be impressed that she has a bit of blue blood? Shall I remind you what color mine is? Felicity chuckled. Good point. Wynne looked confused. And what color is that? Oh, right. I suppose we should introduce you properly, Felicity said. Wynne, meet Percival Cowsland. Percy, this is Senior Enchanter Wynne. She's the healer who patched Mila up at Ostagar. He bowed his head, and Wynne arched an eyebrow, no doubt recognizing his surname. It seems the Grey Wardens have more than their share of nobility, then. Alistair cleared his throat nervously. Speaking of which, this may be a bad time to mention this, but dash. Crash. Oh, for Andraste's sake. You've got to be kidding me. The rest of them were already moving. Marnan opened the door into the corridor beyond, and Hugo charged ahead, barking. Percy rounded the corner and skidded to a stop, startled to find a dragon, of all things. Well, not a full dragon. A drake. Oh wonderful, Alistair groaned behind him. I always wanted to fight something that could bite me in half. Hugo was already leaping at the creature's throat, so Percy didn't waste any time in charging him. Marnan was right behind him, and the two fanned out to either of the creature's flanks. His sword bounced off the drake's tough scales with its first swipe, but he didn't hesitate to thrust his sword in again, trying to get underneath the scales. There was a flurry of high-pitched growls, and a half-dozen baby dragons rounded the corner ahead. Alistair rushed to meet them. The drake's head came around with a growl, and its teeth sank into Percy's shoulder. The pain fanned the heat inside him and spurred him into a rage even as he felt healing magic flow through him, and he used the extra strength of anger to plunge his blade right through the creature's tough scales into its throat. It shrieked, dropped Percy's arm as it tossed its head back. Marnan's axe cut its spinal cord in half at the back of its neck, and it collapsed. Percy's body still burned for blood, but he stepped back and managed to tamp it down as the others cleaned off the last of the dragonlings. What do you suppose a nest of dragons is doing here? Felicity asked, kneeling next to the felled drake. Her hands traced the scales reverently. No doubt Uldred put them here as guardians, Wynne said. Alistair furrowed his brow, prying the last of the baby dragons off his sword. Can blood mages do that? Not blood mages. But one of the libertarians under his command was a respected dracobiologist who may have had a few spare eggs lying about. Wynne sighed. Uldred must have been planning this for months, to be able to bring a Drake in. Well, let's hope his other means of protection are a bit less creative. Fortunately, they were. The party fought their way through a final room of demons rather cathartic, as far as Percy was concerned, before entering a chamber that had a staircase, and a Templar within a glowing cage. The Templar turned as they entered, and his face immediately twisted. This trick again. I know what you are. It won't work. I'll stay strong. Felicity looked caught between shock and heartbreak. Cullen. Alistair jerked in surprise. His head was bowed, but he watched them with a narrowed gaze. Begone, illusions. I will be no more fooled by this one than any of the last. Cullen, it's me. Felicity stepped up to the barrier. What's the matter? What have they done to you? Stop it, I said. The Templar fell to his knees and clasped his head, his voice strained. Andraste, grant me strength. How far they must have delved into my thoughts. Enough visions. If anything in you is human, kill me now and stop this game. Percy winced, knowing too well what such despair felt like. This is your old boyfriend? Alistair asked Felicity with obvious hostility. Felicity burst into tears, still staring at the broken Templar. Percy said coldly, he is fighting the blood magic. He must be far stronger than any of the other Templars. Cullen. Felicity whispered. You broke the others, Cullen gasped, but I will stay strong. For my sake, for theirs. His voice fell to muttering, and there was madness in it. Sifting through my thoughts, tempting me with the one thing I always wanted but could never have. The ill-advised forbidden affair, a mage of all things. I am so tired of these cruel jokes. His voice broke into more sobs. These tricks. These. He broke down into weeping, obviously near his limit. This is horrible, Leliana whispered. There must be something we can do for him. Felicity nodded resolutely, though tears still streamed down her face. Cullen. Cullen, listen to me. We can get out of there. Begone, I said. Why are you still here? I've always been able to banish you before. His voice cracked in panic. Percival could only imagine what sorts of tortures would bring a man to the edge like this. This was a man who had lost everything and then more, that, Percy knew from experience. I don't know if letting him out in this state is a good idea, Marnan said. She watched him with narrowed eyes. We can't leave him, Leliana protested. He's in pain. He's completely off his nut, that's what he is. Alistair said. You'd let loose someone who's obviously lost most of his marbles? He might be dangerous. Percy gave him a hard glare. You'd chain me up as well, then. That's completely different. Come, Alistair, Percy said coldly. We all know what your real problem with him is. Alistair's eyes widened, but he seemed unable to come up with a response. Wynne stepped up behind Felicity. Miss Amel, is this true? Were you and this man truly? Yes, Felicity said. She turned from the Templar who had bowed his head and seemed to be trying to pretend they weren't there and faced the rest of them. Cullen and I were, together. We never got farther than a couple kisses shared behind the stacks, but... She cast a glance back at the Templar, biting her lip. But I still hate to see him in such a state. What can we do? I know of no way to break this spell over him. I do. Niall, he found the litany of Adralla. Wynne's eyes widened. Apparently, that meant something to mages. You have it. I've memorized it. I can use it to break the mental hold the blood mages obviously still have on Cullen. Would that stop him believing us illusions and attacking us? Marnan asked pointedly. I think we can defend ourselves, Percy said. He nodded to Felicity. I say release him. He'd be a strong ally, if he's got this sort of mental resistance. Maybe he's even Grey Warden material, no? Leliana said. No, I think not, Alistair grumbled. Felicity turned back to the trapped Templar. Cullen, I'm going to cleanse your mind. This invoked no response, and she seemed taken aback. Again, she bit her lip before saying, I just want you to know that I'm sorry. For the way things happened between us. You think to use that against me? That I care. Cullen's voice growled, and his eyes, when raised, dripped with contempt. If you've sifted through my thoughts, then you know I'm glad she cut it off, that I was never allowed to get so attached to her, a mage. He said the word the same way Percy said how. Cullen. She yelped, aghast. What a fool I was. But the Maker knows my sins, and I pray he will forgive me. Cullen, you loved me? Love. Cullen sprang to his feet, sneering. No, never. It was the foolish fancy of a naive boy. I know better now. Felicity started crying again, and Percy wasn't surprised to see Alistair's sword come out. Don't you speak to her like that. Is this your new thrall, mage? Your new bit of meat to puppet around? Alistair stepped right up to the barrier, so that only the thin glowing shield separated them. How dare you? Felicity is one of the gentlest, most caring people in Ferelden. I don't care what those blood mages did to you. You will not speak to her like that. Is that clear? Percy arched an eyebrow, because he'd heard royals give orders with less authority in their voices. Cullen looked around them with narrowed eyes, and Percy was glad to see that he actually appeared to see them now. Felicity, her face in her hands. Leliana, jaw dropped in shock. Wynne and Marnan, looking back at the man with equally guarded expressions. Percy, himself, knew what it was like to lose control of oneself, to have one's entire worldview flipped in one cataclysmic event. He couldn't be angry at this man for lashing out. It would be hypocrisy. So you would have me believe you are real, Cullen said sharply. That you came here? Why? Who are you, that you would fight through 4 floors of demons for a couple mages? We're Grey Wardens, Percy said simply, and the Templar's face snapped to his. We came here in search of aid for the Blight. Obviously, we met with some obstacles. The Grey Wardens, yes. Cullen turned his eyes back to Felicity. They'd said you left to join them. Then this is, not an illusion. No. It seemed Percy was the only one capable of words at the moment. We are real, and we will get you out to prove it. What? Alistair whirled on him. Are you insane? After all those nasty things he just said to Felicity, you still want to free this bastard? You'd leave a man to blood magic just because he's been traumatized into hating that very thing which traumatized him. Percy said coldly back. Perhaps you'd better leave me in there as well, then. At least he has some mental fortitude. Percy, this is not about you. No, it's about mustering every possible ally we can against the Blight. We're Grey Wardens, and Grey Wardens do what we must to fight the Darkspawn. That includes helping people who may not be very nice. I agree, Wynne said reluctantly. You've both completely lost your minds. The ex-Templar protested. Alistair, Felicity's voice said softly, and the ex-Templar immediately spun back to her, his face softening. Shakily, she said, I agree with them. I'd still like to free him. Alistair's voice was gentle, and he reached out to hold her elbow supportively. After what this bastard just said to you. I know. She wiped her tears from her eyes. But Percival is right. We can't leave him under the blood mage spell any longer than necessary. Alistair's lips pursed, but his eyes shone with an emotion that made Percy honestly uncomfortable. You're too damned compassionate for your own good, he said thickly, but nonetheless pulled away. She stepped up to the barrier and closed her eyes. Then, she started chanting. At first, it sounded like a prayer that might have been pulled straight from the chant. However, as it went on, Percy felt something in his head loosen, like a collar that had slipped a notch. He could tell from the startled looks around him that the others felt the same. Cullen watched her distrustfully, but the strain in his features slowly ebbed as some of what had been tormenting him faded. By the time Felicity's voice stopped and the mage opened her eyes, Cullen's expression had changed to wonder and relief. Finally, the Templar sighed, hanging his head. One hand rubbed his forehead. I had forgotten what having my thoughts to myself felt like. How long have you been under their spells? Felicity asked. Cullen's head snapped up, and he again regarded her through narrowed eyes. After a moment, he answered. I'm not sure. Since they took over the tower, they caught a bunch of us, put us in cages and tormented us. I'm the only one left. Wynne stepped forward. What did they do with the mages? What, you mean the ones who didn't join them? The Templar scoffed. They were rounded up too. He's been turning them into abominations, but then, if you got this far, you already know that. What of Irving? Wynne pressed. Have you seen the first enchanter? I haven't seen anyone except what they conjured up to torment me. He snapped. And even if I had, what would it matter? Every mage involved in this disaster could be corrupted by now, either a blood mage or possessed. That's not true, the enchanter said with forced calm. I am not a blood mage, nor am I being controlled by any demon. And how would we know that? The Templar looked her over suspiciously. That's the insidious thing about blood mages, you can never tell who's made the deal until they stab themselves and make you dance like a marionette. There must be some way to tell, Marnan said with a frown. No, the only way to defeat the blood mages, to be absolutely sure, is to kill every mage in that chamber. Gasps sounded from around the party. Kill everyone. Leliana squeaked. Surely, there must be some uncorrupted. The Maker would never allow dash. The Maker is the one who bids us to cast those creatures down, Cullen growled. Magic shall serve man, not the other way around. So spoke Andrasta when she cast out the Tevinter Magisters, and so must we uphold that law now. You know, I was considering maybe letting you out of this cage, Alistair said. But now I really can't say I want to. You can do that? Marnan asked. Templars are trained to dispel this sort of thing, Alistair said, glaring at Cullen. Which begs the question of why he hasn't broken out himself. I'm betting they took away his lyrium. Is that why you're so cranky, Cullen? No regular doses of lyrium to take the edge off. Cullen returned the glare. And just what are you supposed to be, then? Some failed Templar who couldn't make it through training. No, much better. I'm a Grey Warden, which means I'm in my full rights to leave you in there to rot, if I think it helps Thetis. And you know what? I'm pretty sure it does. Alistair, Felicity chided softly. Free him. Yes, listen to your mistress, Cullen sneered, like the loyal dog that you are. Hugo whined in confusion. Do I have to, Felicity? Alistair whined. He's such an ass. Despite everything, she smiled. Yes, Alistair. You have to. Alistair sighed, but nonetheless bowed his head and put a hand to his forehead. His face relaxed into a meditative expression, and for a moment Percy wondered that he was about to fall asleep. Then, Alistair pulsed. A blast of energy came out of him, and the barrier fizzled out under it. This left them blinking at a possibly hostile Templar with a grudge against mages in a room with two mages. Percy found himself relieved, despite that. I didn't really expect you to do it, Cullen admitted carefully. My mind is my own, and yet I still thought this might have been a trick. Yes, well, Alistair grumbled. We're just fine upstanding citizens like that. You're Grey Wardens, you said. You're looking for an army. Cullen glanced around at them, his gaze turning to rest on Percy. If you kill the mages, annul the tower, we Templars won't have to guard it. Several voices around the room protested, but he rolled right over them. We will be able to march beside you in full force. No fear of corruption, or blood magic. None of those dangerous magic spells. Magic is one of the most important elements of pitching a war against the Darkspawn, Marnan protested. Without their healing and crowd control abilities, we stand no chance at breaking through to the Archdemon. Cullen spun quickly on her. Percy did not miss the sight of Alistair stepping protectively in front of Felicity. So you'd trust the lives of your army to mages? Yes, I would. Have you not seen how easily corruptible they are? The abominations that roamed this tower that you no doubt had to wade through just to get here were all once mages. All of whom succumbed to the demons that are drawn to them like moths to flame. The mages can't help but be possessed. Percival was reminded of Connor, and he couldn't really argue the point, there. Still, without mages like Felicity, Khazar, and Morrigan, their chances against the Darkspawn were decidedly slimmer. For a moment, he imagined what would happen if a demon dared to approach Morrigan in the Fade. The idea of her disdainful outrage at such a creature, and then prompt brutal destruction of it, gave him a surprising amount of hope for the rest of them. And should such mages turn on us, Percival said, we will slay them accordingly. Until then, they're useful. I see. You will not take my advice. Cullen sighed, looking around at them. Then perhaps it is best if I remain here, rather than accompanying you into the harrowing chamber. He eyed Felicity's dejected form, until Alistair moved to block his view. No matter how much I'd love to kill that cretin, Uldred. I fear that once I start killing mages, I won't be able to stop. Then guard the exit, Percy suggested. If any of the blood mages escape, be sure to lop their heads off. Cullen's hand fell to his sword. That order, I will gladly follow. They left him there, simmering, and climbed the stairs to the final floor. Felicity was still oddly quiet, but that was understandable. They walked in on some sort of ritual in progress. A handful of mages were arranged in a circle around the room, their hands magically bound and their forms sparking with magical energy, painful magical energy, judging by how they tossed around. In the middle of the room was a man and a handful of abominations, all clustered around another sparking mage. This man writhed and screamed, until the mage directing the ritual stepped up and grabbed his chin. Do you accept the gift that I offer? He said sternly, as if this wasn't the first time asking the question. The tortured mage gave the tiniest of nods, and the man let him drop to the ground. The mage lay there, crumpled, while the man and a duo of abominations circled above him. As one, the unholy trio raised their arms and thrust magic into him that seethed with evil even from a distance, and the mage started screaming again. Percy had to look away for the brightness of the light. The screaming stopped, and Percy turned back to see an abomination climbing to his feet where the mage had been a moment before. That, Alistair muttered, was something I never needed to see. It's horrible, Leliana agreed. The man who had been directing the ritual turned toward them, followed by his trio of abominations. Ah, look what we have here, intruders, he said silkily. I bid you welcome. Care to join in our revels? Uldred, how could you? Wynne said softly. Where I come from, Marnan said, stepping forward and addressing the mage, revels involve more alcohol and less evil magic. They do tend to involve a lot of head smashing, though, if you're interested. How very old-fashioned. I am rather impressed that you're still alive. Unfortunately, that must mean you killed my servants. The grin on the madman's face was so oily, it made Percy yearn for a bath. Ah, well. They are probably better off dying in the service of their betters than living with the terrible responsibility of independence. If Morrigan had been there, she would likely have hexed him then and there. Those were once people, you monster. Leliana growled in an uncharacteristically hard tone. And now they are something better, Uldred replied quickly. A mage is but the larval form of something greater. Your chantry vilifies us, calls us abominations when we have truly reached our full potential. Abominations. Alistair said skeptically. That's your full potential. Look at them. Uldred gestured around, at the mages still held captive. They deny themselves the pleasure of becoming something glorious. You're mad. Wynne said. There's nothing glorious about what you've become, Uldred. The mage laughed. Uldred? He is gone. I am Uldred and yet not Uldred. I am more than he was. He smirked at the elder mage. I could give you this gift, Wynne. You and all mages. It would be so much easier if you just accepted it. Yeah, no, Alistair said. I think I speak for all of us when I say, take your glorious transformation and shove it up your nose. Then suffocate on it. The blood mage laughed again. Such confidence. Do you not realize what you're up against? How much resistance I've already put down. Why, even the first enchanter couldn't resist me forever. He gestured to one of the mages, one who was old and grey. Isn't that right, Irving? The mage shuddered, trapped. What have you done to him? Wynne gasped. Stop him. Irving gasped. He is building an army. You're a sly little fox, Irving, Uldred interrupted. Telling on me like that. He turned back to them with a shrug. And here I thought he was starting to turn. There's still hope, Felicity whispered. If we bring the first enchanter back to the Knight Commander unharmed, we'll be able to stop the rite of annulment. Percy whispered under his breath, Hugo, guard the old man. The hound wagged his tail in understanding. The man was still talking. Wander around this tower, knowing you are a pawn of the Templars? You are a thorn in my side, and I must remove you before you fester. Leliana wrinkled her nose. You. I cannot let you leave, but, killing you? Such a waste. He looked around at them all with a sly grin. Such raw potential, with the strength of demons behind it, would be unstoppable. I can do that. I can give you power, and a new life. Percy felt temptation tug at him at the mention of a new life, but he would be damned if he would let it come at the hands of a demon. He turned to look at the others. Marnan, Leliana, Wynne, Felicity, no one was taken in by the offer, and Percy had never felt so proud to be a Grey Warden. Alistair smirked. Smash him to abominable little pieces. Smash him to abominable little pieces, Marnan agreed. I call dibs on the abominations, Percy said, stretching his arms in preparation. Fight if you must, Uldred said snidely. It will just make my victory all the sweeter. He motioned to his abominations, and they needed no more prompting than that. Percy was true to his word and immediately went in to intercept the abominations that came toward them. A swooping blow from his sword caught two of them across the chests, and he turned to jab at the third, just to get its attention. There was a roar from Uldred's direction, and, from the corner of his eye, Percy saw the blood mage transform into a pride demon. It was far larger and more fearsome than any of the religious texts he'd read growing up could have conveyed. Still, he trusted Alistair and Marnan to hold the demon down. He had to keep these three off the mages. As he shifted into a defensive stance between the trio of abominations, he could hear Felicity's voice above the din. She recited the litany continuously, her voice echoing around the chamber. One of the abominations leapt at his back and latched on, its acrid breath against the back of his neck. He reversed his sword and stabbed back, impaling it, and it shrieked in his ear. He slid to the side as the other two lunged in at him, and he raised his shield. One bounced off, but the other slammed into his sword arm as he was bringing it back around. He winced as he felt the creature's claws digging through the joints of his armor. He stepped into its grip, elbowing it right in the solar plexus. Its grip loosened, and he swung his sword into one of its arms, slicing it open. The abomination skidded back, and Percy ducked away, raising sword and shield to slam into another of the creatures that came in on him. He parried an arm swipe with his sword, then slid in to plunge his blade deep into the abomination's heart. It collapsed. That left two, one hunkered over its stabbed stomach and the other with a bleeding arm. Percy wasted no time encircling around the one he'd stabbed. It tried to turn to meet him, but he was too fleet of foot. He pressed his shield against the monster's side to throw it off balance. It tipped a bit, and Percy stabbed its thigh in its weakness. It threw its hands out at him, but a kick to the injured leg sent it sprawling. He plunged his sword into its back, and it fell still. He turned for the last abomination, only to see it pinned to the floor nearby by an arrow through each foot. He sent Leliana a salute, and started toward it. Then, the litany suddenly stopped. Alistair. Percy spun to see what caused such panic in the healer's voice. Alistair was suspended in the air in front of Pride Demon, his head thrown back in a soundless scream. The demon laughed, squeezing his fist together, and Alistair's armor crumpled inward, crushed by an invisible force. Then, Alistair dropped limply to the ground, and the demon turned to the rather startled-looking Marnan. Percival was already moving in their direction as he heard Wynne call, "Felicity," the litany. Stutteringly, Felicity's voice resumed its chant, though there was a tight, worried undercurrent to it now. Percy reached the pride demon as it was encasing the dwarf's feet in frost. Marnan fought valiantly, but only got one leg free before it batted her across the room like a rejected toy. What arrogance this demon exuded! Percy found that pit of rage burning in him and stoked it, mustering his anger until the heat suffused his limbs. He stabbed his sword into its lower back, and the demon hissed and spun on him. He danced back from the mighty swipe, pushing the arm away with his shield so he could jab into the creature's thigh. It laughed, and he growled. He felt a blast of fire hit him straight on, but the burning on his skin was nothing compared to that inside him. He growled again and plunged into the blast. The demon howled as his sword impaled its hand clean through. The demon raised its impaled hand, and Percy, strengthened by his anger, gripped the hand with sword and shield and went up in the air with it. He swung his legs up and kicked the demon full force in the face. It roared again and flung him away. He landed roughly against the stone, his left shoulder jarring and making an unnerving popping noise. It dangled uselessly as he shoved himself to his feet, and the pulsing pain from it served to cover everything in a red haze. With a growl, he let his shield drop to the floor and charged the demon again. He barely registered that Marnan was back to swiping at it with her axe, looking none the worse for wear. Having two healers did seem to have its benefits. His vision red, he slid right through the gigantic monster's legs, cutting its belly open from below. It raised a leg to stomp on him, but stone wrapped around the elevated leg, petrifying it. A spell bolt and an arrow hit it in the back in quick succession. Marnan swept her axe into the frozen leg, tearing it open to the bone, and Percy slashed at its chest. The demon's arms flailed, and fire burst from the creature. Both melee fighters were tossed aside, which was just as well, because a flurry of spells came at it from all directions. The litany rang through the air, and Percy could see the mages around the room bursting free of their prisons. One by one, each threw the most destructive spell they knew at the abomination, lighting up the room with lightning, light, fire, and all manner of other things that Percy could not comprehend. The pride demon screamed, giant patches of its body smoking under the assault. A final arrow from Leliana pierced its heart and the demon's form twisted in a fiery swirl of smoke and ash. It fell to its knees in the cloud, and when the haze lifted, Uldred's body was all that was left. Alistair. Felicity ran across the chamber to where the ex-Templar had crumpled. Her hands shoved a series of healing spells into him. Too panicked to think it through, apparently. Marnan, who had some sense, knelt on Alistair's other side and started working his crushed armor off, because no amount of healing was going to help if the man couldn't breathe properly. Percy was startled when he felt something touching his shoulder. His vision flashed red and he spun on his attacker, only to see Wynne, watching him with a raised eyebrow. "Your shoulder appears to be dislocated. Might I set it, or are you determined to walk around with it like that for the rest of the day?" He forced down his rage and wrapped himself in calm again. Yes. Thank you, that would be appreciated." She tooted and bent to inspect the shoulder. "Such manners, now of all times. I must say you are a most strange young man." She gently touched the shoulder, and he hid a wince. "I will reset it now. This will likely hurt." It did, although her healing magic dulled the pain quickly, at least. Felicity." Alistair's voice wheezed. The man was awake, it seemed. He was still a limp puddle on the ground, though now the healer had his head in her lap. The look they were sharing was so intensely private that Percy looked away. Instead, he followed Wynne as the older woman moved toward the first enchanter. The man sat on the floor, breathing hard. Hugo licked the mage's face encouragingly. This Irving looked up at them wryly as they approached. "Maker, I'm too old for this." "Irving, I'm glad you made it," Wynne said. Percy reached out his non-throbbing arm and helped the old man to his feet. "For a while there," the old man said, "I feared we might not." Voices rose nearby in agreement, the other mages scattered throughout the chamber. "Thank you, Wynne. And the rest of you." Irving turned a curious look on Percy. "To what do we owe this timely rescue?" "We're Grey Wardens," Percy explained, glancing around the chamber. The other mages were picking themselves up and checking one another over. Leliana was, of all things, picking through the corpses, while Marnan resolutely ignored her scavenging and studied the downed abomination. And Alistair and Felicity were speaking quietly to one another, quaint little smiles on their faces. "Maker, virgins." He turned his attention back to Irving. "We were hoping to recruit aid against the Blight, but, obviously, it didn't go as planned." "No, I suppose it did not, and for that, we owe you our lives. That you do. Marnan cast him a raised eyebrow as she stepped up beside them. How many mages survived, do you think? Irving and Wynne exchanged thin glances. At last, Wynne said, other than the ones in this room, and the survivors down on the first floor, there will also be a few out around Ferelden, pursuing their research and such. Only some of those would be suitable for combat. Still, Irving added with confidence, even a few mages can turn the tide of battle. We will help you fight the Darkspawn however we can. It's the least we can do. Marnan nodded her thanks, always diplomatic. It is all we can ask. Percy thought this a good time to break in. There is one other matter. Yes. You are not the only ones who have had some difficulty with abominations. There is a matter concerning the Arl of Redcliffe that needs raw lyrium. Apparently, his young son is an untrained mage who somehow managed to attract a demon. Now, the entire village is besieged by undead. Oh dear, Irving said. Yes, I can see how that could have happened, if the boy was untrained. How would lyrium help, precisely? Blood magic, Alistair's voice wheezed darkly. He joined the conversation, slung between Felicity and Leliana with an arm around each woman's shoulders. There's a Maleficar at Redcliffe who was attempting to teach the boy, Percy elaborated. And failing, apparently. He suggested a ritual that can send someone to the Fade. Yes, I see, Irving said. To confront the demon directly. That could work. But to use blood magic. It's either that, or kill the boy, Alistair said. I just can't do that. Not when he was just trying to protect Eamon. Everyone but Percy looked confused by that. I think. Wynne said gently, starting for the door. The rest of them followed. That you two had better start from the beginning. You can fill us in during our trip. 64 A family matter. He'd sworn to himself he wouldn't come back here. Yet, here he was. Ankle deep in multiple kinds of refuse, smelling the stink of tunnels too tight and too populated, and staring at a scum-encrusted doorway he'd sworn he'd walked away from forever. You are unnerved, Sten observed. Was that the word for it? Garrot wasn't sure. He'd come here on some gut-wrenching impulse, despite the fact that he knew it was a bad idea. He was starting to make rash decisions based more on instinct than calculation, apparently maybe it was a Grey Warden thing. Promise me one thing, Sten. If things get messy, don't kill anyone. You are telling me not to fight for our defense. The Cunary sounded miffed. Why? He'd been doing that more and more lately, questioning him. It was almost enough to make a guy feel inadequate. Let's just say I'd rather you didn't decapitate my mother. I see. The giant paused. I do not understand the pointless importance you Southerners put on kin ties. If she is worthy of being decapitated, why not let it be so? It's a respect thing, Sten. This woman raised me and Rika on scraps, somehow between all the drinking, anyway. You do not sound respectful. Yeah, go figure. Just, don't kill her, okay. Sten seemed to mull that over, then sighed. Very well. It was low, as if it were against his better judgment. The dwarf was half on board with that sentiment. Garrot nodded his thanks and waded through the muck, opening the door without preamble. The two-room shack was warm, at least, with the hearth lit. Even so, Garrot had forgotten what a rotten pisshole the place was. After staying places like the Spoiled Princess and an upper end inn on the edge of the Diamond Quarter, gratis for the financially conscious Grey Warden, of course, he couldn't imagine living in this dung pile. Old trash littered the floor, and the walls were stained with decades of filth. It carried the same stink as the rest of Dust Town, with the addition of one particular sharp tang that Garrot had gotten to know very well growing up. Sodding stone, girl. Slurred a voice from the back room, where Garrot knew the beds were. I've told you time and again not to come sloppin' through Dust Town. Those boots are too damn nice to dash. The voice fell silent as its owner stepped through the doorway. Callah's hair was the same scraggly red mess, her face brand stark against her splotchy skin. Her bloodshot eyes narrowed at the sight of him. I don't think my boots are in any danger of getting worse, Garrot said. Darkspawn bloodstains pretty damn bad. Don't you sass me, boy, his mother snapped. She stalked across the hut and backhanded him. Garrot felt Sten tense up behind him, but the Cunary was as good as his word. Who do you think you are, waltzing back through the slums like you own the place? How long you been back, huh? Days. Days, and you don't even visit your own mother, you ungrateful whelp. I had a hear that you were in Orzammer from Alamar. This had been a bad idea. He'd known this had been a bad idea. Why had he come, again? Garrot took a breath, schooling his face into neutrality. I had business in Dash. Don't feed me that slop, you little wretch. You were down here just yesterday, pokin' your nose in Carta business, 'cause you just can't leave anything alone. And now what we got down here to keep us afloat, huh? Am I supposed to go back to cleanin' chimneys? Despite himself, Garrot felt anger stir in him, along with something else that felt an awful lot like grief. I killed Leske yesterday. And it's all about you, ain't it? You just had to have your revenge, and now all us dusters are gonna starve, because you went and slaughtered the only thing that made us matter. We never mattered. Garrot rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it came out as a vicious roar. Even Kala, in her drunken rage, flinched back. Those people up there? They never cared about us, they're too busy living in their shiny little worlds to give a shit about the dusters. The only reason any of them ever cared about the Carta is because it dipped into their own profits. If that's all dusters had going for then maybe it's better I slaughtered Why you? We can be so much more. We can be craftsmen, and fighters, and sodding paragons, if we work at it. We just have to get the chance. Kala was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Once, the words coming out of his mouth would have felt like idealistic drivel, except now they felt sodding true. That's what I've been doing since I got back. Belen claims he's gonna change our lot if he gets put on the throne, let us in the army, make us respectable. I don't know if he intends to keep his word, but I'm gonna sodding make him keep it. Kala let out a bitter, dry laugh. You really believe that, don't you? I do, he growled back. The insanity that had infused him was fading, leaving him simply tired with dealing with all of it. He turned and started toward the door. Sten even ducked down and held it open for him. Don't you turn your back on me. Go sleep it off, old lady. Next time you see me, the world'll have one less archdemon. 65 The Laughing Killer. Night over Red Cliff was beautiful in its own way, she supposed. The lake shimmered in the darkness, and the lanterns across the village below flickered with a sort of charm not unlike fireflies. She could not get used to the blocky stone, though, nor the presence of so many Shemlin. Humans, Mila chided herself. Humans. If one of them had the nobility to give her own life for kin and clan, it was the least Mila could do to respect them for that capacity. She perched on a small bridge between the castle and the town, the waterfall above her sending soothing sprays across her back as she looked out over the village and the lake. The white wolf sat beside her, and she wondered what it saw as it looked over the village. Territory? A rival pack? What could a white wolf that may or may not have been Witherfang possibly think of these strange situations? Mila did not think it her place to pry, even if she thought she could. It was enough, for her, that the wolf continued to deem them worthy of protection. If that protection did not extend to the interiors of stone buildings, she couldn't say she blamed the noble beast. The only reason she herself tolerated such places was because they were so dear to her lethal linen. And there was one of them now. Her eyes narrowed as she heard his voice, and she leaned over the bridge banister to try to catch sight of him. Sure enough, he and the Dintusimal the Laughing Killer were hopping between the rooftops below. Tonight, it seemed they were engaged in a game of agility. Finian's figure leapt lightly across a gap in the rooftops, and he slid down to the eaves before he caught himself, laughing. The assassin followed suit, his voice low and purring, probably saying something deliberately provocative. Mila did not trust the assassin. She did not trust his too easy laugh. She did not trust his quiet way of walking. And she especially did not trust the way he clung onto Finian like a wolf guarding its meal. If Finian himself were not so adamant about the usefulness of such a being, Mila and Khazar both would have killed the man days ago. Then again, the young mage was another concern of hers. Ever since the mage's trip to the Fade the previous night, Khazar had been acting strangely. He was jumpy and snappish, more prickly, and prone to temper than usual. Yet, at the same time, there was a strange shine in his eyes. As if the boy were immensely satisfied with something. Any questions, of course, were immediately met with a flare of temper. Jowan had nearly lost his hair because of that. Still, Jowan was proving exceptionally adept at soothing the younger mage's temper, a skill, it seemed, that had been honed over many years of practice. The blood mage was another perplexing puzzle. Mila had been given to understand that all blood mages were like Zithrian, scheming and twisted by their magics. Yet Jowan was not. He was bumbling and, if anything, too gentle, to the point of being gullible. He had poisoned Eamon, true, but because he had been tricked with promises of civic duty and return to a quiet life in a gilded cage. The assassin teased the blood mage incessantly about being tricked into working for the obvious villain. However, it was obvious the assassin did not believe in such labels himself. It was clear to her that this Sevranarina's morality was strictly based on personal gain. She heard the pair approaching now, and smoothly slipped off the bridge, secreting herself in the recess under it. Fang silently followed suit. So I joined her in the carriage for the night and left the next morning. Finian's laughter rang through the night. And she didn't try to kill you? Well, yes. Twice, actually, the assassin said gaily. Then she decided to try and use me instead. 2 sets of light leather boots passed above her, and then continued on up toward the castle. She waited for a moment, then climbed back up to the path and silently fell into step some distance behind them. The woman had actually convinced me to speak to the crows on her behalf. What can I say? I was young and foolish at the time. Then, as I was kissing her goodbye to return to Antova City, she slipped on the threshold and fell backwards out of the carriage. Broke her neck. The assassin's shoulders rose in a shrug. Shame, really, but at least it happened quickly. So, you didn't actually kill her? Mila was alarmed to hear only amusement in Finn's voice, not chastisement. Not as such, no. Ah, but as it turned out this was a stroke of luck on my part. I later found out she had told the driver to take her to Genellan Island instead. She had planned to lose me in the provinces. I would have looked very foolish to the crows. They passed through the portcullis into the castle, and Mila stopped underneath it, slipping into a shadow. As it was, my master was very impressed that I had done such a fine job making it look like an accident. The circle of magi was unaware of foul play, and everyone was happier all around. Another stunning victory for the great Sevranarina, Finn laughed. Does that sort of thing happen a lot? You mean being spared by a benevolent mark who then helps me escape from the crows? The assassin elbowed the pickpocket playfully, and Finn laughed again. Yes, it does seem to happen now and again, doesn't it? The pair stopped walking outside the castle side entrance that both seemed to favor over the main one. Apparently, neither wanted to go inside just yet. It was after that when I learned that one needn't let a pretty face go to one's head. Professionalism is key. That's my moral of the day, you see. Right, you're nothing if not professional, Finn deadpanned. Ah, what can I say? The assassin leaned close to Finian, and Mila frowned. I am known to break my own morals, from time to time. Then again, this exception to the rule did not come easily. You did have to capture me and tie me up first. He leaned in closer, so that Mila could barely see his grin. Now that I've mentioned tying me up in that context, do we have any extra rope about? Finian stepped back quickly, though his face showed nothing but amusement. I'd better get inside. You know how the others worry about you corrupting me. And with good reason. I would indeed enjoy corrupting you. Sleep well, my dear warden. I know I will, with dreams full of you. Finian laughed once more and ducked into the side entrance. Once it shut, the assassin let out a dark chuckle and stretched like a cat. It is not polite, you know, to eavesdrop on private conversations, the assassin purred to the night sky. Though I admit, I do not see why he seems so interested in my various adventures. I would hardly accuse you of the same, my beautiful Dalish maiden. Seeing no point in hiding from a quarry who knew she was there, she stalked forward. He didn't even flinch as she grabbed him by the front of his vest and pressed her hunting knife to his throat. Even then, he wore that same crooked grin. "Ah, this is the part where you demand to know my intentions with your fellow warden." "Yes. I know perfectly well what you intend," Mila informed him. "You claim you spent a short time among the Dalish, so you know how important kin are to us." She leaned in threateningly. "I consider Finian to be my kin. If you hurt him, in any way, I will hunt you with such single-mindedness that you will throw yourself at your crows just to escape me." She didn't let him answer, swiping a thin line of blood pointedly across his throat. He still didn't flinch, but the smile did drop off his face. His eyes were half-lidded, calculating, as she walked away. 66 Reunions and Revelations. Wynne wasn't entirely sure why she requested Irving's permission to go with the wardens. Perhaps it was her maternal instincts kicking in, that she worried for the young people. Perhaps it was because she had missed Miss Amel, one of her protégées, in the past months. Perhaps it was her wish to do something important and right before she crossed the Vale. Whatever it was, she now found herself standing on the deck of a ferry boat crossing Lake Callanhood, watching the distant silhouette of Redcliffe Castle draw nearer and nearer. The afternoon sun felt unusually bright after so many days in the darkness of the Circle Tower, and the early summer wind was brisk and warm on her skin. She sipped the tea Felicity had brewed, smiling as she noted the presence of certain calming herbs in the mix. It was so like the dear girl, to worry that she might be anxious, when it was the wardens who should, by all rights, be nervous wrecks. It would only be an hour or so now before they arrived. After nearly a day on the boat, they would no doubt be happy to see land again. And here was one now who would be particularly happy to see land, stumbling across the deck to cling to the side. The poor dwarf retched once again, and Wynne politely averted her eyes until she was done. "Ancestors," Marnan mumbled dryly. "And I used to think having no land above me was unnerving." Wynne hummed and walked over to the dwarf. She laid her free hand on the woman's back and sent her a bit of healing magic to settle her stomach. The mage also offered her cup of tea, which Marnan politely waved away. "Thank you," Marnan sighed. She turned and leaned back against the railing, still a bit green. "Where does all this water come from, anyway? Does it all fall from the sky?" Wynne chuckled. "That is part of it, yes. We have lakes underground, of course. Springs, and streams from runoff. But it's always from up above, from the surface. I never wondered where it came from before the surface. At some point, you have to run out of up." Wynne leaned against the railing next to her. "There is a philosophy in there somewhere, I think. If there is, I'm too damned tired to think of it." Marnan closed her eyes against the sun. "The first thing I'm going to do when I get solid ground under me again is fall asleep on the nearest bed. Or cot. Or large domestic animal. As long as it is soft, I will not care. Your stomach bothered you last night? I thought Felicity provided you with a potion to soothe it." "She did. But she should have provided Leliana with a sleeping potion. Sharing cabin space with a bard is not advisable for those who would rather rest than hear tales from far-off lands all night." "Ah, I see," Wynne said, trying to stay appropriately solemn. Marnan angled a shallow smile at her. "Oh, go ahead and laugh. Someone should." "I apologize, Marnan," she chuckled. "I mean no disrespect. I know. I suppose it is better that than listening to Felicity scribble into her codex all night. At least Leliana's stories are interesting." Wynne chuckled again, because she was the one who had shared cabin space with the younger mage. "I admit, being old does have its advantages. One of those is falling asleep easily, despite incessant quill scratching. If only we could all be so fortunate," Marnan sighed with a half-laugh. She fell silent and leaned back against the balustrade, and Wynne resumed her watch. The castle was closer now. Not much longer. What she did not have the heart, nor the right, to mention was the fact that Felicity had done more the night before than write in her book, though, yes, there was a good deal of that. Wynne should have expected the girl would take to documenting her travels once she was out of the tower. As it happened, Wynne had awakened in the wee hours of the morning to hear the girl stifling tears into her pillow. Felicity did not seem to want anyone else to know, however, even Win. This was a surprise to the enchanter, who was used to the younger mage storming into her chambers at the slightest upset and venting until Win had relented and agreed to help remedy whatever had upset her. Then again, even Win had no cure for what affected the girl now. Win did not think it wise for Felicity to bottle herself up as she apparently had been, and the enchanter had to remind herself not to meddle overmuch. She had pushed one apprentice away by being too overbearing, she could not do so again. Marnan and Win both jumped as a shriek rent the air, followed by the thundering tread of heavy steps coming from below decks. A moment later, Alistair burst out onto the deck, laughing and clutching a sheet of paper in his hand. "Alistair, give it back." Felicity followed 4 steps behind, her face blushing darkly. "Oh dear." Alistair crossed straight to the balustrade next to Win, holding the sheet of paper out at arm's length over the water. "No need to be embarrassed. I think it makes me look quite dashing." Felicity leaned against the rail next to him, trying to snatch the paper back, but her reach was no match for his. "It's an anatomical study. Purely academic." "Which is why you were academically hiding it under your pillow," Alistair laughed, winking at Win and Marnan. Leliana and Percival could be seen peeking up the stairs from below decks. The bard giggled knowingly, while young Lord Cowsland merely rolled his eyes and disappeared again. Win had been rather surprised to see the obvious chemistry between her protégé and this young warden man, almost as surprised as she had been to learn about the girl's brief fling with Cullen. Whether with a Templar or a warden, Felicity had always seemed to be a relatively asexual girl, especially compared to the notoriously insatiable appetites of certain other mages around the tower. To learn that she had carried a brief affair, no matter how trivial, with a Templar, and that Win had never suspected, well, it indicated that Felicity was perhaps a great deal better at secrecy than she would have given the girl credit for. This Alistair, though, he was a good enough boy, that much was obvious. But it was also obvious that this was distracting them, as evidenced by Felicity's difficulty with the litany after the boy had been injured. Such distractions were dangerous in Grey Wardens. Certainly, Felicity was smart enough to see that, and that was why it hadn't gotten any farther than these flirtations. On top of that, Felicity's apparent fixation on Templars was rather worrying. Win would so hate to see the girl make the same mistakes that she had. Perhaps that, if it progressed, would be worth some meddling. "What is it?" Marnan asked her fellow wardens slowly, as if against her better judgment. "Well, remember yesterday, Marnan," Alistair sang, "when we were practicing our weapons out on deck?" "Yes, of course. You remember that it was warm out here, so I had my shirt off." "Right. You and Percival both. And you remember Felicity, scribbling at what we thought was just another codex page." "I think I see where this is going." Felicity stopped trying to grab the paper with a huff, her skin dark with a very telling blush. "It was a motion study. In the future, it will help me to learn more precisely where the muscles are located during active poses, for more efficient healing mid-battle." "Right," Alistair chuckled. "That's why they're all of me, and none of Percy." "Well. But, just give it back." He laughed but relented and handed her the paper, and Felicity stalked off in a huff. Even as the door below decks slammed shut behind her, he didn't stop grinning. "Is it bad that I think she's adorable even when she's angry? How hopeless is that, on a scale of 1 to 10? About a 6, I think." Marnan arched an eyebrow. "Realized it, have you? In the fade, yeah." He turned to face them, leaning against the railing. Today, he was dressed in comfortable travel clothes, like most of them, rather than his borrowed Templar armor, the only full set of armor available, after his previous suit had been crushed. It was easy to forget how large the boy was, when he wore armor, but it was hard to deny it in a simple tunic and breeches. "But after that whole Cullen thing, I don't really have the courage to tell her." "That doesn't stop you from teasing her, I see," Win chided gently. "I can't help it. I'm weak. And bored. And she's really pretty. And here I thought most boys grew out of pulling pigtails," Win said thoughtfully. "Alistair is very much a child at heart," Marnan said. "Hey. I am right here, you know." Both women laughed. Wynne glanced across the lake and saw that the village docks were in sight. It would only be a matter of minutes, now. It looks like we shall be arriving soon. I shall go see if I can't stir the other three to gather their things, and perhaps I shall smooth over a certain girl's temper while I'm at it. Alistair gave her a pair of puppy eyes. Yes please. Shaking her head, she went below deck to fetch the other three. Sure enough, they did arrive within 10 minutes, and everyone was relieved to be on solid ground again, judging by the groans and sighs as they disembarked. Even the dog bounded around the dock happily. Well, this place looks much better, Alistair said, hefting the sack of lyrium dust they'd managed to collect from the caves under the tower. He looked around the bustling village with a smile. Percival, on the other hand, frowned, though that was hardly a change from usual. A bit too much better. Where are the barricades? Took 'em down, said one of the dock workers who was helping them tie off the ferry. He smiled at the wardens. Don't need 'em anymore, now the Chambliers are gone for good. Both men paled, and Wynne could guess, judging by the story they'd told the women, why they were worried. What do you mean, Alistair said slowly, by gone for good? The dock worker shrugged. They were gone for a bit, right? When the first wardens came by. But then they came back. It wasn't until the second group of wardens went up to the castle that they stopped altogether. The wardens exchanged glances. What second group? Percival asked in a low voice. I dunno. Bunch of elves. They're staying up at the castle, though they'll come down to town every once in a while. Just look for an armed elf, and safe bet that's a warden. Thank you for telling us, Marnan said diplomatically. That's good to hear. The dock worker saluted and wandered off. The group immediately huddled up, and Alistair snapped out, Khazar, that little twerp. He performed the ritual, I just know it. Wynne had known that Khazar Sirana had been recruited to the order alongside Felicity, but she hadn't expected quite this hostility from a fellow warden. Alistair, the enchanter chided. Calm down. Calm down. Are you joking? He would have had to kill someone, Wynne. Unless the Dalish elves suddenly have huge stores of lyrium lying about. We should wait until we hear his side, no. Leliana said. Finian never would have let him hurt anyone needlessly. Not without reason. Marnan snorted a laugh. Keep in mind you speak of the man who talked a group of highwaymen into walking to their own deaths. I still would have liked to see that. What? Wynne tried to detect whether Marnan was joking, but could detect no humor in her tone. Whatever happened, Percival said in a low voice, standing here arguing about it isn't going to help. Let's go up to the castle and check out the situation there. Since when are you the practical one? Alistair grumped. Nonetheless, he followed as Percy started up to the castle, and the rest trailed behind them with their travel loads. Wynne ran an assessing gaze over the villagers as they passed. The town had the feel of a place at the beginning stages of rebuilding, with the remains of chaos being picked through and cleared bit by bit. According to the boys, the village had been under siege. It was good to see the town in good spirits after such disaster, though she did see a couple long faces. They walked up a long hill, and Wynne was soon digging her staff into the ground just to keep up with the young people. At one point, Marnan offered to take her bag. Wynne hesitated, but then accepted, because there was really no point in wearing herself out and slowing all of them down. As they passed a windmill, Hugo sniffed a tree and started growling. This made Percival stop and, since he was in the lead, the rest followed suit. What is it, boy? The dog turned up the path and barked. A white wolf rounded the corner in the cliffside path ahead of them, its ears pricked. When it saw Hugo, it lowered its head and growled in return. Oh goody, Alistair groaned. A welcoming party. What do you want to bet there's more of them just around the corner, ready to eat us? A familiar elf stepped out behind the wolf. Actually, no. No one is eating anyone. She knelt down beside the wolf, and whispered to it, rubbing the scruff of its neck. Slowly, the hostility left the wolf's stance. Out of habit, Wynne ran an assessing eye over Mila Mahariel. The girl had made a miraculous recovery indeed, showing no sign whatsoever of having carried the taint for so long, when most people who survived it at least had lesions and growths. Mila! Felicity cried, and Wynne was rather startled when the girl ran up the hill and enveloped the other in a hug. From the look on the elf's face, Mila was equally surprised. This broke the ice, and the rest of them climbed the hill in lighter spirits, obviously happy to see their fellow. All except the dog, who hung his head and followed Percival reluctantly. "You look well," Marnan said as they pulled up beside her. "Is it just me or do I see a few more beads in your hair?" "Yes, you do. You have a wolf now." Alistair looked quizzically at the animal. "Where did you get a wolf?" "In the forest, I would assume," Percival said flatly. "Hugo, play nice." The Maberry whined uncertainly. "Just because the wolf marked your territory doesn't mean you can glare at him like that." The dog gave a short woof and Wynne swore it was practically a conversation. Maberry were intelligent, reportedly, but could they really be that smart? "This is Fang," Mila said, extricating herself from Felicity's hug with obvious discomfort over the gesture. It was a wonder that she tolerated it. "He is not a pet, he is a friend. We helped him and his pack in the Bricelian forest, and so now he helps us." Alistair stared. "You helped a pack of wolves? It is a long story." Her eyes fell on Wynne. The girl's jaw hardened and she stepped forward, and Wynne braced herself, unsure what the proud Dalish elf had in mind. To her surprise, Mila bowed her head. "I never thanked you, Harin, for what you did for me. You saved my life at Ostagar, and for that I can never hope to repay you." Wynne smiled, even as everyone else stared at the elf in shock. "I need no thanks, we should all be so lucky as to help the Grey Wardens. All the same, your thanks are appreciated." Mila nodded sharply and turned away, perhaps uncomfortable. The rest of the Wardens watched her with wide eyes and slack jaws. "What is it?" "Who?" Alistair sputtered. "Who are you, and what did you do to the standoffish Dalish elf we all knew and were kind of afraid of?" Mila stiffened, her expression going stony. "You would prefer I go back to calling you all Shemlin and running off into the forest alone?" No. This is good. Forget I said anything." "How were the Dalish?" Leliana asked, and the elven woman stiffened further. The gaze she leveled at the bard was cool. "Was it much different from your own clan?" "Yes. A bit. But it was not a bad difference, it gave us a chance to share our different songs and stories amongst ourselves, and both with Finian and Khazar. Somehow, I can't really imagine Khazar singing along with the Dalish," Alistair snorted. "He did. He has quite a good singing voice, as a matter of fact." Wynne wasn't the only one to chuckle as Alistair's mouth dropped. "Yes, the Circle Tower does try to teach basic pitch and tone. To protect the Templars' hearing, as I understand it, since they're the ones who have to listen to us in the baths." Marnan cast her a worried look. "They even watch you in the baths." "It's not nearly so bad as that," Felicity said quickly. "They merely stand outside the door. You do have to be quick, though. If you take more than 3 minutes to wash, they assume you're practicing blood magic and bang down the door." Felicity rolled her eyes. "Maker forbid you run out of soap and have to ask them to fetch more." Although, Percival said grimly, their paranoia does make sense, given recent events. Uldred and the others had to practice their craft somewhere. The Wardens fell silent at that, thinking for a moment. Alistair turned to the elf. "Mila, what happened here? Did Khazar do the blood magic ritual?" She eyed him a moment before answering. "He did, yes. That little son of Dash." "Alistair," Felicity sighed. "I do not understand," Mila said. "Why is this a bad thing? Was it not preferable to exterminate the demon as soon as possible?" "Not if someone had to die," Alistair said through gritted teeth. "People were dying anyway," Mila said flatly. "Every night, those things came down to attack the town. Many people died. If we had to take one life, freely given, to stop the deaths of many, then it was a necessary sacrifice, for the good of the community. So the undead were coming down every night." Marnan sighed. "That's why you did the ritual. Who was sacrificed?" Percival said very softly, though it was apparent by his clenched fists that his calm was very fragile. "Was it Lady Isolde?" "Yes." Alistair cursed, and Percy abruptly turned and walked 3 steps away, breathing deeply. "I can't." Alistair sputtered. "I can't believe this. How could you guys do this?" "Why? I do not understand the question," Mila said. "I just told you why." "He's just upset," Felicity said softly to the elf. "Just. I'm not just upset." He turned toward Felicity, but didn't seem to have the heart to yell at her, so he spun on Mila instead. "I'm really, really upset. And pissed off. We had a plan." "And so did we," Mila said stiffly, meeting him glare for glare. "I understand the mother's death was not ideal dash." "Not ideal?" Alistair snapped. "Now you look here, just because she's human doesn't mean that she d-dash." Mila had a hunting knife out and at Alistair's throat in a flash, and now, instead of stiff and stoic, she looked livid. "How dare you imply such a thing, alas. That woman's sacrifice was one of the most noble things I've seen any of your kind do, and I will not have you belittling it, nor me, by implying that we allowed it out of hatred." "We?" Percival's voice asked softly. He was still turned away from them, his stance a picture of tension. "All 3 of us agreed that it was the best path." Mila stepped back stiffly and put her knife away. "Still, it is very sad," Leliana said, "for the boy to lose his mother in such a way. Because of his own actions, even." Alistair took a shaky breath and dropped his head into his hands. "Eamon's never going to forgive us." "Is Ban Tegan still in charge?" Percival asked, turning back to the group. Mila nodded, and the group started moving again, this time with Mila and the wolf in tow. The atmosphere between them was very raw. "This Connor," Wynne said reluctantly, breaking the tense silence. "Now that the demon is taken care of, he will need to be transferred to the tower as soon as possible. Perhaps we should wait until his father is awake first, no?" Leliana said. "So that he at least has a chance to say goodbye." Wynne frowned, unsure that was wise, but the others nodded, and it was not her place to tell all of them what was right and wrong. No matter how much she may have wanted to. They climbed the hill to a grand stone castle, the courtyard alive with militiamen and knights running through their paces. The white wolf broke away from them at this point, disappearing into the woods by the castle. Up a staircase and through a doorway, they entered into a throne room that was depressingly marked by bloodstains and empty of anyone who might guide them. Here, the path branched off, and the wardens paused uncertainly. "Where do you suppose everyone is?" Marnan asked. Percy turned to his hound. "Hugo, find Finn." The dog barked happily and jetted off. He led them through another hall with more doors, and paused at a closed one opposite them. There, the dog sat and barked again. A moment later, a grinning elven face poked out. "Hugo." The Maberry tackled the elf to the ground, laying sloppy kisses all over the elf's laughing face. Wynne had seen the young man before, but only in passing. He had poked his head in while she was treating Mila at Ostagar, asking after her recovery. He seemed a nice enough boy, though she didn't know him nearly as well as she did the other 2 elven wardens. "Finian, is that a Dalish liar?" Leliana said excitedly, breaking the silence as if it had never been. "Yeah," the elf replied from under the dog. "I was hoping you could, Bleg, Hugo. Teach me how to play it." "Come on, get off, maybe." The bard grinned. "Of course." The door Finian had come through opened wider, revealing what appeared to be an office beyond it. Several men stood around a desk inside it, including a man in knight's armor, a man in chainmail, and another elf. The man in chainmail stepped out with a broad smile. "Ah, Alistair, you've finally returned. You were taking so long, we were worried you'd run into trouble." "Yeah, Tegan, funny story, we did. You'll have to tell me some other time. For now, come in. You're just in time for Ser Donal's report on the sacred ashes." "You've found them?" Leliana gasped in awe, and Wynne was very confused. She had heard nothing about the sacred artifact until now, at least not as the urn pertained to the wardens. No. But we may have made some progress." They were ushered into the little room, which swiftly became cramped with all of them packed in. The man in knight's armor, who introduced himself as Ser Donal, explained that he had heard the Chantry scholar, Ferdinand Genitivi, was currently researching it. This, as Wynne expected, elicited an excited gasp from Felicity. Brother Genitivi? The brother Genitivi? Oh, I've read all of his books, he's the Chantry's foremost scholar in the current age. Where is he? Is he here? Sir Donal laughed. No, last I heard, he was residing in Denerim. Sounds like as good a place to start as any. Felicity turned to Finian. You're from Denerim, right? Do you know where he lives? Have you ever seen him? Would he mind if we stopped by? Finian gave her a baffled look. Felicity, I'm an elf. In Denerim, elves and famous Chantry scholars don't tend to link arms and take strolls down the boardwalk. He shrugged. Though I suppose I could help ask around. Wynne smiled and laid a hand on the younger mage's shoulder to calm her. All in time, dear. Still, it was good to hear the girl excited about something again. What's this about the urn of sacred ashes, now? Arleeman's sick, Finian began. You mean he was poisoned? Alistair growled. Right. The elf didn't miss a beat. Thing is, nothing works to cure him. So, the Garin household figures, if they're stuck praying for miracles, why not help it along a little? Wynne hummed and thought. Well, that certainly is a good thought. But I am not unfamiliar with curative mixtures myself. Perhaps I might try my hand at curing your Arl. There was a low chuckle from near the wall, where the other elf leaned against it and watched them with dancing eyes. Trust me, no amount of healing herbs will be able to cure that poison. The elf spoke in an Antivan accent. It is a rather ingenious mixture, actually. A little nightshade, a drop of ASP poison, a good dollop of sleeping potion. Well, I dare not reveal the entire recipe trade secret, you understand, but rest assured it is quite complex. It is also obviously made with the express purpose of not being curable, should your amateur assassin have been discovered. Which he was. The man chuckled again. Considering how little expense your Tairn Loghain took in finding the vessel to carry out the assassination, the poison itself would have been excessively expensive. I'm rather insulted none of us were hired for the job. Everyone was quiet for a moment. Wynne, for her part, was wondering whether she could take this man's word that healing magic would do no good for the Arl. Alistair's eyes narrowed. And just who are you supposed to be? Ah, my apologies. It is very rude of me not to introduce myself. The elf pushed off from the wall and swept a deep bow. I am Zevran Arena of the Crows of Antiva. Alarm bells immediately tolled in Wynne's head, and she abruptly pushed any of the children near her away from the dangerous man. You're an assassin, Leliana said, with far less horror and far more fascination than Wynne would have liked. Really, now? Well, yes, that goes without saying. The man's smile remained bright, and Wynne was disturbed to see how their fear and hatred amused him. As a matter of fact, I was hired by your Tairn Loghain to murder you all. Don't worry. I probably won't do it. A number of weapons left their respective holsters and sheaths, and the assassin's grin didn't fade. It brightened, in fact, when Finian slid between him and them, putting his back to the assassin. Hey, Finian said placatingly. It's all right. He's joking about that last part. The elven warden sent a glare back at the assassin. His sense of humor has appalling timing. The assassin chuckled. Ah, but we cannot all be silver-tongued rascals, my dear warden. Finn, Alistair said slowly. He seemed to be developing a night twitch. Tell me you didn't know about this. Well, yeah. Considering we first met him when he was trying to kill us. Mila, who was leaning against the opposite wall, spoke up now, her voice hard. Perhaps one of you can talk some sense into him. I do not trust the assassin, and neither should any of us. An assassin, Percival said thoughtfully. You're thinking to use him against Loghain. Yes, exactly, Finian said in obvious relief. As eyes widened all around, he quickly added, not that I intend to assassinate Loghain, necessarily. It's just a good card up the sleeve, you know? Just in case the civil war isn't resolving itself fast enough. It was the same sort of staring that Mila had gotten outside. Wynne agreed that the idea was appalling, but the wardens were staring as if the boy had grown a second head. "Are you feeling all right?" Leliana ventured softly. Finian sighed, exasperated. "These are desperate times. And if Loghain's desperate enough to send assassins after us, it's a good idea for us to have someone on our side who knows how they work. It's the same reasoning that we used when first testing Leliana. It's just that Zevran's profession is a bit more taboo." "Taboo?" Alistair sputtered. "He's an assassin, Finn. He's going to kill us in our sleep, he just pretty much said so right to our faces." "He's not going to kill us," Finian said flatly, his smile dropping. Behind it was a creature who was much more cunning. "The truth is, he already tried to kill us. And he failed, badly. That means that as soon as he leaves our company, the crows will track him down and kill him in the most painful, most humiliating way possible. He has to stay with us and keep us alive to save his own skin. Do you seriously think I hadn't thought this through? That I'm that gullible?" Again, shocked silence met the outburst. "He stays," Finian said firmly. "As my man alone, if need be. If you have a problem with that, come talk to me later, but be warned that there isn't a sovereign's chance in the market that I'm discarding a card this valuable." Wynne was sure that this course of action wasn't wise, but it seemed the young elf wouldn't be persuaded by his friends, so what chance did she have? "Well, this is a pleasant twist," Alistair sighed. "Percival and me pick up a merchant on the road, while the girls recruit an extra healer. The elves? They pick up a murderer for hire. I wonder what Garot'll pick up in Orzammer? Maybe a reformed darkspawn. Or oh, I know, Marnon's treacherous brother." "Don't even jest about that," Marnon said wide-eyed. The door behind them opened, and a lightly tattooed head full of spiky strawberry blonde hair poked in. "Oh look. I thought I heard a cat being drowned, but it turns out it's just Alistair's whining." "Khazar," Alistair growled in return. The young mage stepped into the room, and Wynne wasn't surprised to see Jowan's head poke in behind him. Since hearing that both mages were present in the same castle, she had figured as much. Jowan had always followed young Mr. Serana around like a puppy. "So how was the circle tower?" Khazar said with narrowed eyes, looking around the room. "Have fun. Oh look, you picked up another Nagi healer. Hooray. Khazar." Felicity hissed. "It's all right, Felicity," Wynne said gently. She nodded to the young man. "How are you, Khazar?" He glared at her suspiciously through narrowed eyes. "Fine. Great. Why are you here?" "I wish to help the wardens." She smiled. "I believe that puts me in your service, rather than the other way around." "Oh Khazar, it's awful." Felicity burst out. "Abominations completely destroyed the circle tower." Khazar turned his narrow gaze to her. "And why should I care? I say good riddance." "You can't mean that. It was your home dash. Only because they took me away from my real home. Let me repeat, good riddance." "I care." Jowan put in, wide-eyed. "What happened?" Felicity turned immediately hostile. "Blood magic happened, Jowan." Jowan's swallow was audible, and he shrank away. Khazar jumped in front of him protectively, his infamous temper sparking in his eyes. "An abomination took over here, too, and blood magic saved everyone." "Saved everyone by killing Lady Isolde, you mean?" Alistair snapped. "That was her decision, Alistair," Finian broke in calmly. "She practically begged us to do it, because she knew her son was suffering." "You too, Finn." "If not for Jowan's blood magic," Khazar said pointedly, "that village down there would be a smoking ruin right now." "Right. Since when have you cared about helping people?" "Whether you believe it or not, Templar, I am a Grey Warden just like you. I fucking care. Lay off." He spun and stalked out, and Jowan slipped out just in time to avoid the door as Khazar slammed it behind them. "He has been more ornery as of late," Mila said blandly. Alistair shook his head. "How can you tell?" "Believe it or not, he has gotten better," Finian said softly. The forest mellowed him a bit. He moved to the desk, where a sheaf of papers was set out. "Maybe he's getting restless, though." We all know how he loves to wreak destruction. Wynne had to nod to that. She had taught the boy from time to time, after all. And patched up victims of his temper tantrums. Finian's eyes suddenly lit with an idea. Hey, since we're all here twiddling our thumbs anyway, maybe we can do something about the urn. Felicity leapt on it right away. You mean track down Brother Genitivi? Oh, that would be amazing, Leliana breathed. To see the remains of Androsta herself, can you imagine? Is it wise to get so distracted from the blight? Marnan asked with a frown. It's not a distraction, Finn said. It's helping our Lehman. Who, I remind you all, is pivotal in stopping this civil war among the nobility. So tracking down some human holy relic is pivotal. Mila asked doubtfully. Not just a human relic, Leliana gushed. Androsta's ashes belong to the world. I find that naive. Well, it's true. We should leave as soon as possible, Felicity said, her eyes sparkling as she warmed to the idea. The sooner we set out, the sooner we either find the ashes or discover that they are unobtainable, and then the sooner we will be able to turn our attention back to the archdemon. Marnan sighed. In that case, I suppose we should leave tomorrow morning. Is everyone good with that? There were nods all around, and the various wardens excused themselves to go pack and otherwise prepare themselves for the trip. Wynne could only blink and try to absorb what she'd seen so far. These children were the Grey Wardens upon whom the fate of Ferelden rested? Perhaps it was fortunate she had elected to come with them, no matter the reason. They all had a lot of work ahead of them. 67 Open mouth, insert silk-shod foot. Leliana hummed to herself as she dug through the next bureau. The tune was an old Riveni sea shanty, nothing all that deep or meaningful, but fun. Lots of verses about wenching and plunder. In her old life, it had kind of made her want to be a Riveni pirate. She laughed to herself at the thought. Companion to the Grey Wardens during a blight was a definite step up from anything she'd been in the past, bard, lay sister, spy, or anything else. Who knew that in running from Orlays, she would find her true calling? Ah, but the Maker did work in mysterious ways. To think that the Chantry thought that the Maker had turned from the world, it was obvious his hand was still at work. The Wardens alone were proof of that. Leliana paused in her rummaging to pull out one of the outfits in the bureau. It was a classic man's quilted doublet with embroidered stitching in various colors, with a white linen undershirt underneath. Most men would look quite dashing in it. It looked to be about Alistair's or Percival's size. Maybe she could get one of them to wear it somewhere, just for fun? Well, maybe not Percival. The doer man obviously didn't like her, with how he glared at her whenever she tried to speak to him. But Alistair was nice. Maybe Felicity could help bully him into it. It'd be doing the girl a favor, after all, to put him in decent clothes for a change. She laughed at the thought and draped the outfit over a chair with a handful of other salvageable ones. She was currently in one of the various abandoned quarters around the castle. Most of the remaining staff and the guests had all taken rooms as near the entrance hall as possible, leaving little hallways like this one abandoned yet. Leliana wasn't really one to steal wantonly. Maker forbid. But such nice clothes would be eaten by mothballs before the servants ever got to this wing of the castle, so it was her civic duty to rescue them. And any matching shoes, of course. It was a relief, anyway, to be away from the Wardens for at least a little while. They were fascinating people, and many of them were quite nice, but she needed a break. If it wasn't Alistair and the elf mage nearly coming to blows, then it was everyone's mistrust of the Antivan Crow. If it wasn't that, then it was Percival and Mila both glaring at her if she so much as looked in their directions. And dinner had been very awkward, because Alistair was still angry at the elves, and everyone else obviously wanted to know about the other team's adventures, but no one was willing to reveal more than the bare details of their own. It would have been funny, if Leliana hadn't been bursting with curiosity after the elves clammed up over as simple a question as where the white wolf had come from. Leliana laid a final outfit, a slimming satin dress she intended to give a try herself, on the top of her pile and folded all of it into the wicker basket she'd brought for just that purpose. Humming to herself, she left the room and started down the hall, toward the next set of rooms. She paused though, her humming falling silent, as her ears picked up another song. The voice wasn't refined, but it was strong and sure, and the melody of the song itself was positively haunting. Melava in an inansel. Ir suaraval tu elvaral. Una Emma abelas. She set the basket down and stepped softly as she followed the sound. She turned a corner in the corridor and reached a window that faced into a small courtyard. The moonlight illuminated a copse of decorative trees and clusters of flowering bushes, with a stone path weaving between the greenery. A garden, though one much less strictly organized than the kind Leliana had often seen in Orlais. This garden was still somehow untamed, much like the rest of Ferelden. In Elgar sa vir mana. In Denerim din Emma na. Between two of those trees hung a hammock, with a familiar Dalish elf sprawled in it, lit by a lantern swinging on a branch just above her head. Mila sang to herself in what the bard recognized as the ancient elven tongue, the elf's expression and posture utterly serene as she concentrated on something she was doing with her hands. Carving, Leliana realized, seeing the glint of metal. Lath Sullivan. Latharavaliene. Arla ventu vir maver. Leliana perched at the window, fascinated by the song. Mila Mahariel was no bard, able to evoke any emotion by an inflection of the voice, but her heart was in whatever she was singing, and her voice caressed the ancient language like family. Abruptly, the song stopped, and Leliana blinked and realized that Mila was staring over at her. "Oh, please don't stop. That was beautiful." "I wasn't singing it for you," Mila said shortly. She turned back to her carving, but now seemed to be glaring at the item in her hand more than shaping it. "I'm sorry to intrude, then. But may I ask what it's about? It sounds sad." The elf's eyes flickered back up toward her, unreadable. "It is, and yet it isn't." Leliana waited, hoping that the elf would go on. After a long silence, Mila sat up in the hammock and peered at her. The bard had never met an elf with such piercing eyes before. Then again, she had never met a Dalish elf. They were not as savage and fearsome as the tales said, but they were certainly proud, if the Dalish warden was anything to go by. "It is a song of Arlathan, our homeland," Mila said softly. "Of loss, and enduring to a better future." "That's beautiful." "Yes. It is." The Dalish elf looked at her with stony eyes. "Is there something you want of me?" Leliana leaned against the windowsill and shrugged, enjoying the cool night breeze that wafted past her. "What are you doing out here? Surely, you don't sleep out here." Mila stiffened, frozen as if by an ice spell. "And why is that so far-fetched? The others grow anxious if I camp outside the castle perimeter, and I do not wish to sleep within stone walls. This is a good compromise, is it not? What's wrong with stone walls? I happen to find comfort in knowing there is a foot of stone between me and the rest of the world. Like a big shield, you know." "I do not know," Mila said flatly. She set her carving tools aside and stood, and Leliana realized she was still wearing her leathers. "Are you sleeping in your armor?" Leliana gasped. "Of course," the elf all but snapped. "What else would I sleep in? A nightgown, or a robe? Something soft, and fluffy. And what good would that do if I were attacked during the night?" Leliana stared, and realized then that the elf truly came from an entirely different world. How strange she must find everything here. "What is it like?" The Dalish elf blinked, looking taken aback by the abrupt shift. "What? To be a Dalish elf? Such a lifestyle, living in the forest, must be peaceful." Mila's stony expression cracked into one of sheer incredulity. "Peaceful? Know you nothing about the history between our peoples?" "Of course I do. I did not mean it like that." Leliana paused, trying to come up with a good way to say it. "I meant that your people live simpler lives, closer to the earth." Mila stiffened. "It is not simple. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to belittle your culture. I have met few elves who were not pledged to the service of an Orlshian noble dash. Slaves? No." Leliana said in alarm. "They're serfs." Mila had gone very cold. "They serve humans and are never offered anything better. What you humans call the practice makes little difference. It is not a bad life. Maker, this was coming out all wrong. Elven servants are well compensated for their services. A well-trained servant is highly valued in Orlais. Elves are nimble and dexterous, and many people find them pleasing to look at. So your kind treats us like pets, to be bred and kept for utility and entertainment. No, that's not what I'm saying. You asked what it is like, Shemlin, to be Dalish. Now, there was heat in those piercing eyes. It is not merely a matter of being close to the earth, as you seem to think. We live like we do because we have no place to settle that does not belong to Shemlin. We are not content to submit to the servitude of your kind, and so there's no other option but to avoid your civilization altogether. It doesn't have to be that way. There are many ways an elf can get ahead in the city's dash. We do not wish to be free in spite of being elves. Each of us should be judged on our own merits and abilities. You're an elven Grey Warden. Perhaps you can serve as a good example for your people. And what would count as a good example? Many city folk tell tales of the Dalish, of how you snatch away children in the night. If you showed people how well-behaved you are dash. Well-behaved? Mila actually sputtered. I am not some pet who can be told to sit and stay on cue. I did not say you were. You did not have to. Mila gave her the coldest, hardest look Leliana had ever seen. It was refreshing, almost, to have someone show you unabashedly what they thought of you. In Orlais, people smiled and talked circles around one another, and this sort of conversation would never have happened. You see my kind as different from yours, and that is why you fear us. I don't fear you. Mila's eyes narrowed. Perhaps not fear, Shemlin, but you still see us differently. Leliana paled, because there was truth to the elf's protests. I did not realize I was doing that. I'm sorry. The fury fell from Mila's face, and the elf eyed her suspiciously. You truly mean that? Of course. I will try better in the future to not let my past conceptions cover my sight, yes. The suspicion seeped away from the elf's expression, making way for bafflement. You do not mind that I stood up to you, just now? Leliana just shrugged and smiled. No, I don't mind. You gave me something to think about. The elf looked away, back to her carvings. I had not expected that. More softly, she muttered, perhaps there is some merit in rethinking preconceptions on both sides. With that puzzling statement, Mila slipped back into her hammock and resumed her carving. After a moment of Leliana watching her at it, Mila glanced up again. What is it? Thank you for the talk. It was interesting. The elf blinked, startled. You are a strange human. Leliana grinned and just nodded a farewell, have a good night. She turned and walked back through the castle deep in thought. So distracted was she that she did not remember to retrieve the found outfits until an hour later. 68 A Ballad of Dangerous Men. Finian was hiding. Blatantly and unashamedly. He wasn't sure what had happened at the circle, but it had put something hard in Percival's eyes. Something that made him keep glancing over at Finian with cool distance and betrayal. He didn't want to deal with that. He couldn't deal with that, after everything. Finn sighed, plucking idly at the strings of his lyre, too softly to make any real noise. He was nestled between shelves in the Redcliffe Castle wine cellar, a single lantern casting flickering shadows across the walls. Not the most pleasant of places. It was cold, even in summer, and it had yet to be cleaned after the siege, but it was better than the castle dungeons. Those two places were the only ones that weren't crawling with wardens and warden companions, and Finn had no intention of using the other place. His fingers danced out a short melancholic melody, and it sounded much better than it would have a week ago. Just 4 simple notes in a minor key. He hummed an echo of the notes, wondering if there was a song in there somewhere. Or if there had to be. He'd have to ask Leliana. He winced in the privacy of the cellar, thinking about the reunion earlier that day. It could have gone better, and probably would have, if Zevran hadn't been there. Or Khazar. Or Alistair, for that matter. Any combination of those 3 seemed like a bad idea. Still, he was glad to see everyone back and in one piece, with the exceptions of the Orzammer crew, of course. And if he was inappropriately glad to see Percival, well, that was his problem. Especially if said noble was apparently not so happy to see him. He laughed quietly to himself, plucking out another string of notes. Soothing, this time. A liar was a lot like a person, he mused. You just had to know what strings to pull. An unflattering thought, but there it was. Like Felicity. Distract her with something that piques her curiosity, and she would jump right on it, and drag everyone else along with her. The argument about Zevran, Alistair's outrage over Isolde, and Khazar's little outburst, all had been wiped from memory by the mere suggestion of tracking down Genitivi. He admitted that he had his own reasons for wanting to go to Denerim. It had been his home, so of course he did. He just needed to see how they were faring. The mess he had left behind couldn't have been easy to clean up. He needed to assess the damage. He sat back with a sigh, and his pockets jingled. He winced again, because his fingers had rediscovered their old twitch in the past couple days. Jewelry, papers, gems, runes, anything that might sell to a vendor outside Redcliffe had found its way into his pockets these last days. He tried to feel ashamed, but very little of his finds would be missed, and every sovereign they could squeeze meant one more that could be put toward the war effort. Saving the world didn't come cheap, after all. The others didn't know it, but Finian was already planning how they would get into Denerim, the very seat of the man who wanted them very, very dead. They needed disguises, and that meant buying different clothes, and supplies, and maybe even a cart. The elves would likely slip by all right, though they needed some sort of skin-colored powder to mask certain facial tattoos, and no one would look twice at Leliana if she wore her chantry robes instead of her leathers. But how to mask a big, loud man like Alistair? Or worse, grim, glaring Percival? When you glared at people like that, they tended to remember you, if only because they were afraid you'd corner them in a dark alley. And that was outside the fact that Percy was a noble, and thus had likely met half the Bluebloods in Ferelden. He sighed, and his next string of notes was sharp and discordant. Just like his thoughts. Maybe the others were right. Maybe keeping Zevran on was a bad idea. It wasn't that Finn didn't trust the assassin not to kill them. He could read people well enough to know that the assassin's fear of Crow retaliation was genuine, but rather he didn't trust the assassin on general principle. The man was wily. And selfish. And cunning. And charming. And fun. And handsome. And dangerous. Wait, was he putting dangerous under the positive qualities? Right. Well, that was part of the problem right there, wasn't it? First Percy, now Zevran. He had always been attracted to the worst kinds of men, starting way back with that conman's son when he was 12. One of these days, it was going to get him killed. It nearly had, back in his Aiden days. He still couldn't believe he'd told Mila and Khazar that story, fit of werewolf onset panic or not. All his life, he'd had a strict policy of keeping his preferences between himself and his lovers. He'd made the mistake once of being less discreet, with that conman's son. The conman's son's father, the conman, had ingrained it on Finian in no uncertain terms that such things were meant to be kept to the shadows. It got awkward, otherwise, and, depending on the person, it got potentially very painful. And then awkward again when your curious cousins scoop your battered body out of a gutter the next morning. That was why not even Sorais and Shiani knew about his preferences, much less anyone else in the alienage. He'd kept his futurists strictly outside the walls of the elven community, because he couldn't bear to think of disappointing his father like that. An elf was supposed to grow up and get married, and Finn never would. A bark broke the silence, followed by the distinctive sound of a Maberry hound thundering down rickety cellar stairs. Finian leaned his head back against the rack behind him with a hopeless laugh. Percival, you cheater. Hugo rounded a wine rack and barked happily, obviously delighted to have found Finn. Little did Hugo know that he was just a pawn for his evil, cheating master, who came around the rack after his hound. Percival crossed his arms and leaned against the rack, cutting an imposing figure, even out of his armor as he was. Hiding, are you? Finian shrugged. I wanted to practice my playing without hurting everyone's ears. Percy looked at him flatly for a moment, then sighed. You're a good liar, Finn. I do try. Don't. It's not a compliment. Finn bent over his lyre, pretending not to be aware of the blue eyes boring into him. Why did you kill Lady Isolde? The note he was about to strum came out sour, and he carefully corrected his fingering. So that was what had been bothering the man. I didn't. Jowan did. But you had final say. No, that was Tegan. The noble slammed a fist against the rack, making a dozen bottles clink and threatened to fall. Finian froze and dared to look up. Percy looked livid. Don't read me that tripe. Tegan agreed with us. They all did. Then you were there for 5 minutes, with your silver tongue, and suddenly they changed their minds? Do you really think I'm that stupid? No, Finn said softly, even while inside he felt something shatter. I don't. The noble's jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Then I have to assume you wanted Isolde to die. Just tell me why, Finn. You owe me that. Finn swallowed and gently set the lyre aside. No use pretending to play it, and in this state, Percy may very well smash the instrument over Finian's head anyway. It was the most good for the greatest number. You killed a woman. To save an entire town. With blood magic. Finn winced. Well, yeah. It was for a good cause dash. The circle tower was utterly rooted by a blood mage. It's evil, Finian. He stiffened, but stayed sitting. If he stood right now, Percy might just punch him in his current state. With careful calmness that he didn't feel, Finn explained, it was either that, or allow the undead to continue attacking the town. Finn forced himself to meet Percival's eyes, showing the noble his conviction that, yes, he was still sure he'd done the right thing. What is it about killing one to save 100 that is so evil? Is it the fact that the one death is decided as a departure from the default and must be actively carried out, whereas the 100 are from negligence alone and therefore require no active killing on our part? Is that what makes it wrong? You don't know that any more townsfolk would have died, Percy argued back. You and the others could have simply fought beside the town defenders until we returned, but no. You took the route that involved sacrificing a human being to blood magic. Percival turned away to calm himself, and Finn took the reprieve from those blue eyes to catch his breath. I'm sorry it had to happen, really, Finian said softly, watching Percy pull himself back from the brink. The human was really, genuinely upset about this, on a personal level more than a moralistic one. But it was about ensuring that the fewest people possible died. We couldn't take the chance of another attack on the town. And the ends justify the means, no matter how brutal, is that it? Percy said in a cold voice. No. Maker's stained socks, this was hitting all the uncomfortable places that Finn had been ignoring over the weeks. I mean, okay, a little. It stopped the undead. Doesn't that count for anything? Percy slowly turned and regarded Finn through a hard mask that even he had difficulty reading. The noble took a long, slow breath through his nose, then said, My mother died defending me. Oh. The pain of such a loss is indescribable. Knowing that your life was somehow deemed more important than hers. More worthy, when she was one of the most important people in the world to you. Percy looked away. Did you consider Connor at all? You took his mother from him. Did you consider that, in your calculations? Finian found it hard to breathe, all of a sudden. He thought of his own mother, and how many habits he'd picked up over the years that she would have disapproved of. He couldn't imagine how much worse it would feel if she'd actively given his life for his. No, he admitted softly. I had not. He stared down at his hands to hide a wave of shame. This was the cost, he realized, of playing games with lives. People were so much more complex than playing cards or a lyre's strings. Actions could have rippling consequences. He knew that. But he'd missed this part. Or maybe he just hadn't wanted to think about it. What sort of monster was he? But, even then, as he replayed the sight of all those bodies by the barricade, he couldn't say he would have done any differently if asked to do it again. Percy sighed into the silence and moved in to sit across from him. The tension seemed to be leaving the noble's form, now that he'd said his piece. I won't apologize for it, Finian said quietly. But you're right. How it affects Connor is awful, and I'll bear the guilt for that for the rest of my life. Percy's blue eyes searched his, as if for artifice, but he wouldn't find any. Then, the human nodded to himself, and more of the tension left his shoulders. I just keep imagining what it will be like, when he loses his father as well. You don't know that. Finn reached for his lyre, and plucked out a few light, Soothing notes. They both seemed to need it. We're going after the ashes, after all. Percival made an incredulous noise. We might find them. Chasing after echoes and dreams, if you ask me. Finn reached out a foot to gently nudge Hugo, who was sprawled out between them. We're Grey Wardens. We do what we must, right? And if we must find the sacred ashes of Androstat, then I suppose the cosmos has no choice but to abide by that. Percy slanted a glance at him. Somehow, I doubt that is how it works. Finian shrugged and bent back over the lyre. The tension between them was breaking, bit by bit, and he was suddenly feeling very aware of the noble's presence. Would you like to talk about her? Your mother. Percival leaned back against the shelf, his eyes going distant. For a moment, Finn thought he might do just that. Then, Percival shook his head sadly. No, I'd best not. He sat up again. I promised myself I wouldn't dwell on the past. We must keep moving forward, and not be bogged down by old pains. He paused. Apparently, it's harder to do than I thought it would be. It's certainly not easy, Finn agreed. The song coming out of the lyre now was distant and sad. I know I had trouble doing anything, after my mother died. But if you smile and tell everyone you're fine for long enough, even you start to believe it, right? Percy gave a weak huff of a laugh. Finian nudged Percy with his foot. I think happy memories, though, should be dwelled upon. The laugh was a bit stronger this time, if also a little incredulous. You're like a mulberry with a bone sometimes, aren't you? Finn dared to smile. I just like hearing about you. I think you're interesting. Interesting. That earned him an aristocratically arched brow. Victory. Am I like some sort of study subject, then? What about me could possibly be that fascinating? Good point. You're obviously dull as dirt. Finn leaned forward and scratched Hugo behind the ears. Let's talk about Hugo, then. He's the most interesting of the lot of us, I think. Hugo barked his agreement, and that got a far more genuine laugh from the nobleman. Percy leaned back, fully relaxed now. He was still achingly serious, though. I know you mean it in jest, but it is still good to be asked. About myself, I mean. He stretched out, his foot nudging his hound. It is a good thing that you took the time and care you did when we first met. You saved my life and sanity. I've never thanked you for that. Finn smiled, fighting not to show how much such earnestness from Percy affected him. It was hardly as dramatic as that. It was. If you hadn't been there. I can't say what would have happened. I'd probably have gone mad, thrown myself off the bridge at Ostagar. You made things bearable. Thank you. Maker, Percy was an unfairly beautiful man, especially when his blue eyes were going soft like that. Finn stared down at the lyre to hide the heat that crept up onto his cheeks. You're welcome, for what it's worth. But it hardly was anything as dramatic as you shielding me from further attack with your own body when I was severely injured at the Tower of Ishal. Percy's smile was slight, but more than Finn could have hoped for. His pulse quickened. I would say it was much more. I suppose we'll have to disagree on who saved who, then. Finian reached to the wine rack above him and pulled out one that looked like a decent vintage. He popped the cork and held it up. Here's to being less heroic than the other guy. Percy chuckled, and reached for the bottle once Finn had had the first taste. The nobleman took a sip and swirled it around in his mouth, and Finn had never seen someone take wine so seriously. When he had swallowed, Percy arched a brow. What? I've never actually seen someone do that with spirits before. This, my friend, is wine. You may gulp down other forms of drink, but wine is meant to be enjoyed before it goes to the head. Finian laughed and reached out to take the bottle back. All right, you posh, high-class noble, educate the poor deprived elf. And so he did, extolling upon bases and grapes, and Finian sat back to enjoy it. The pair stayed down there for the better part of an hour, passing the bottle back and forth while Hugo dozed contentedly between them. They spoke of inconsequential things, past misadventures, Percy's conquests, Denerim, familial anecdotes, and, yes, their mother's anything but the current situation and the blight. By the time the bottle was most of the way gone, Finian was feeling pleasantly warm and fuzzy, and growing more so every time Percy laughed. The nobleman's face was flushed, practically glowing every time he smiled. Which was quite a bit, once he got some wine in him. Came by later, of course, he was saying with a devilish grin that made Finn's blood purr. Her father nearly had an aneurysm when he opened the door to see me standing there. Oh, how he glared. Then, he slammed the door in my face. His laugh was warm and free, and Finian wanted to throw high melf on the noble then and there. Of course, there's nothing more thrilling to a young woman than a forbidden affair, so I just had to walk around to the window and pull her out of it. He raised the near-empty wine bottle in toast. I introduced her to more than sex that night. Finn chuckled. Some might say you corrupted her. Percy shrugged, still smirking. Corrupted? Debauched? Freed? It's all about point of view. He wanted very badly to be debauched by Percival, especially when the man grinned like that. Perhaps Finn was a bit more drunk than he'd thought, drunk on wine. She and he would never have let him live this down, because he never would have said what he did next sober. So with all those women you've tumbled, have you ever tried something else? Percy gave a baffled laugh. What, like spanking? I always found that sort of thing a bit gauche. Not exactly that, no. Finn lowered his voice, even though they were the only ones there. Have you ever tried bedding another man? Percy looked startled by the question, as if it had truly never occurred to him. Finn's blood warmed as he watched the nobleman honestly think it over. No immediate disgust, that was good. Then again, given Percival's apparent experience, Finn had expected him to be relatively open-minded. I can't say I'd ever considered it, no. Would you like to try it? Percy's eyes widened, and Finn chuckled. There are certain things, you know, that women aren't really equipped to understand. Are you coming onto me? Stunned. And a little frightened. Finn shrugged casually, even while his heart pounded. It's just something I thought might be fun. Percy looked at him silently for a long time, or it felt long, anyway. Finn watched the emotions play across his face, shock, confusion, disgust, and a tiny spark of curiosity. And then, horror. Percy stood abruptly. I should get going. It's getting late. Finn kept his grin, like it didn't matter. So it's just women, then. Of course. I suppose you're right. Finn chuckled lightly. The girls will probably roll us out of bed at a completely unreasonable hour tomorrow. Mila is of the firm belief that every minute of daylight is meant to be utilized, including the minutes before the sun has technically risen. Percy didn't respond, just looked down at him with a blank expression. Finn let his smile fade, because it didn't seem to be helping anything. For a long time, they just looked at one another, and Finian was surprised to find that he couldn't read the nobleman. Laying between them, Hugo whined. Finally, Percy looked away. Good night, Finn. Night, Percy. Percival left. Hugo woofed and stared after him. Then, with one last look at Finian, the Maberry sprang to his feet and scampered after the noble. After the sounds of their footsteps had faded, Finn let his head fall back against the rack. Then, he forced a laugh. Can't blame a guy for trying. A lyrical chuckle filled the cellar. But you can have a good laugh at his expense when he fails, yes. Finn jerked upright. Zevran. How long have you been here? Long enough. The crow's form emerged from the shadows at the end of the aisle, a cat's grin on his features. Tisk tisk, Warden. Propositioning people behind my back. Here I thought I was the shameless one. You still are. Finian found himself wishing he was a bit less tipsy at the moment. He'd never be able to keep up with the assassin's quick wit in his current state. Last I knew, spying was frowned upon, yet you show no remorse. Ah, but why would I be remorseful when it means I now have you all alone and at my mercy? Zevran's voice was wrapping around him like a warm fog, and his heartbeat was picking up again. Especially as Zevran prowled closer. Finn leaned back casually against the wine rack, trying for a cocky grin. And now that I'm at your mercy, assassin, what do you intend to do with me? Whatever I wish, of course. His voice was a purr. You will find being my prisoner most agreeable, I think. Zevran stopped 2 steps from him, his eyes running over Finn with a predatory gleam. That look made Finn's head spin more than the wine had. Somehow, Finn got some words out, though he barely registered them. I'm pretty sure that taking me hostage is a violation of our contract. Not the way I treat my hostages, it is not. Zevran crouched down in front of him, gently lifting the lyre out of his lap and setting it aside. Finian let him, too distracted by how the lamplight danced across the other elf's skin. I am your man, Warden. Without reservation. The way his tongue rolled around that last word made Finian shiver. Judging by the sudden quirk of his lips, the crow had seen it. It is my duty to see to the health and well-being of my employer, yes? And if that display just now was anything to go by, there are certain needs of yours that are not being attended to. They should be addressed. Zevran's face was a foot from his own, leaning over him. Still, Finian managed to collect his wits together, because he wasn't going to just let a dark, sexy, and apparently willing man reduce him to a stuttering puddle. When you put it that way, you make it sound like I was throwing myself at Percy. Not throwing, precisely. But I have a feeling your offer was a great deal more sincere than you let him think. Zevran reached out, and Finn's breath hitched as the assassin's fingers played lightly along his collar. It is becoming much clearer to me why you have been declining my advances until now. At this, part of the fuzzy spell over Finn broke, and his heart started pounding for a different reason than the assassin's proximity. He forced a laugh. What are you saying, exactly? That you think I'm in love with him? Oh, not love. That would be silly. But a man has needs, yes? And that nobleman of yours surely used to be the focus of several of yours. Zevran's other hand gently rested on his knee, and his thoughts turned dizzy again. Used to be. The crow's eyes darkened as he chuckled, and Finn shivered again. That was all before you picked me up, of course. The hand at his collar moved up to trace his jugular, and Finn couldn't seem to breathe right. His head tilted back of its own accord. Now, I think you will be pleasantly surprised to find that you will no longer have any need of him at all. Convenient, no. The hand on his knee slid up his thigh, and Finn's reply was cut off by a sound between a squeak and a moan. Zevran chuckled again, the sound of his voice making heat coil in all the right places. You seem rather at a loss for words, Warden. His head swooped in, and for a moment, Finn thought he was coming in for a kiss. Then, instead, Zevran ducked down and licked a line up his throat. Finn's arms wrapped around Zevran, because now he could feel the other elf's warmth, and he had better not dare pull away. Zevran, he managed, if this is another joke. No joke, my Warden. His lips moved against his collarbone, and Finn had to bite back another keen. Simply tell me what you want, and you will have it. It is as simple as that. Finian thought about fighting it. Zevran was an assassin, and one who used sex as a tool as often as not. He was a predator, and that thought should not thrill him the way it did. His head was too thick with wine and lithe, overpowering man to think of any more protest than that, and any doubts were swiftly shucked aside when Zevran's lower hand reached his upper thigh. Take me to bed, Zevran. The assassin's hand moved even higher, and he didn't bother biting back his moan. Tonight. Now. Zevran's laughing eyes met his, and that chuckle made him melt. As you command, my Warden. He was already so wound up that the assassin's first kiss had him seeing stars. He turned to putty in the assassin's talented hands, and the crow wasted no time in showing him an entirely new array of skills he had to offer. As Finn gave in to what the crow offered, he wasted no thoughts of the Blight, or Percival, or anything except a pair of very talented hands, playing him like a lute as they drew him up and toward the bedroom Finn had staked out. And if this night's events led to more awkwardness with Percival the next morning, well, he couldn't say he regretted it. Provided the assassin didn't stab him in his sleep or anything. But for this? That was a risk he was willing to take. 69 A friend's mistakes. Jowan had been trying not to let Khazar out of his sight for too long. A large part of it was survival instinct, as most of the current castle inhabitants would have been happy to throw Jowan back into his cell, or, even better, off the Arling's eponymous cliff. The young elf certainly provided him a modicum of protection from the rest of them, but there was more to it than that. They had been friends, once, practically brothers. Jowan wasn't sure what they were now, but a bond of 12 years could not so easily be broken. There was proof enough in the fact that the notoriously volatile Khazar Surana hadn't killed him on sight when they had crossed paths again. Then again, perhaps that leniency was more because of Khazar himself than because of their bond. Something in the elf had changed, though it was difficult for Jowan to place what, exactly, that change was. He was still temperamental, cocky, and cynical, but there was something different, too, something deeper. Like now. Back at the tower, when Khazar was upset, he would take it out on the nearest inanimate object and go into a stormy fury that would take Jowan hours to coax him down from. But now, he simply disappeared. No flung spells. No cornering innocents and letting them have the sharp edge of his tongue. Just, ducking out away from everyone and finding a quiet place to brood. That was how Jowan found him up on the battlements, after a good 3 hours of searching the castle. Khazar had stormed off after dinner, when he and Alistair had very nearly attacked one another in an ongoing argument about the necessity of Lady Isolde's death. Jowan had spent most of the meal sunk low in his chair, trying not to call attention to himself. Usually, when Khazar stormed off, Jowan just had to follow the trail of scorch marks and crying apprentices to find him again. This new Khazar was less destructive. It was both encouraging and unsettling. In any case, he managed to find Khazar up on the top of the castle's walls, leaning on the balustrade while he looked out over Lake Callanhood. His posture was contemplative, and that was another shock in itself. Khazar didn't contemplate anything. He just did things, and then looked annoyed when older mages, that was, all of them, chided him for not thinking. Again, it was a development that was both encouraging and unsettling. What had happened to his young friend to change him like this? Well, other than being betrayed by a blood mage best friend. And being nearly killed at a rout at Ostagar. And killing a mother to save a child. Stupid question, actually. Do you think you can see the tower from here, on sunny days? Khazar asked as Jowan approached. Jowan stopped respectfully just outside Khazar's immediate blast range, turning idly to glance over the lake. It was night, thus far too dark to see anything, of course. The stars were pretty, though. No, it's too far. I've looked. Khazar's laugh was more of a snort. It's ridiculous, isn't it? Even when we're free of the tower, our lives still revolve around it. People from it keep popping into my life, despite my wishes for the opposite, and you went and poisoned a guy just to get back in. It was just the one time, and yet no one lets it go, Jowan joked lightly, though it wasn't really a joking matter, what with the Arl still being sick. Khazar laughed anyway. Tell me about it. Try traveling with Amel sometime. I helped one Maleficar escape, and she forever after treats me like a naughty little brother she has to teach better. Well, rest assured the Maleficar is very grateful. Yeah, he better be. The smirk Khazar slanted at him in the starlight was wry, but also a little fond, and Jowan was glad he had one person who wouldn't be happier to see him hanged. I think he can repay me by acting as my human shield between me and her for, say, the next year or so. Jowan's heart sank, because of course Khazar didn't know. He never talked to Tegan, so he wouldn't. Khazar, I'm not going with you to Denerim. The elf scoffed. You really think I'm letting you slip away again? Ban Tegan has demanded that I remain here until Arleman either wakes up or dies. In either case, my fate will be decided then. Khazar turned fully to face him, looking at him quizzically. And you're just going to take that? Stand here and let yourself be caged again. Jowan sighed. I'm tired of running. I knew the consequences of my actions would catch up to me someday. I'm sick of trying to avoid them. Khazar looked at him long and hard, the blankness in his expression making Jowan's stomach twist. Khazar didn't do blank. Then, the elf scoffed again and turned away. Sure, run from me and Lily, but make her forbid Tegan should ask you to sit and stay. Betraying him would just be wrong. I'm sorry, Jowan said. Again. Still heartfelt. And pained, what with the mention of Lily. Khazar didn't look at him. Why did you do it, Jowan? I told you. I panicked. With Grigor and Irving, and Lily going to be sent to ENR-. Not that. It wasn't a snap. It was an earnest question, asked with a sidelong glance. What made you strike the deal in the first place? Jowen's world spun, because he'd never expected anyone to ask him that, especially not Khazar. He leaned against the battlements to steady himself, looking up at the stars while he thought about how best to explain it. Or whether to explain it at all. It wasn't my choice, originally. Khazar snorted, disbelieving. To learn it, you made a deal with a demon. That's not the sort of thing you can just blunder into. I didn't approach the demon, all right? It found me. Jowen sighed. Look, things between Lily and me were just starting to get serious, right? So I was restless, worried that we'd be caught, and that made my defenses in the Fade weaker than normal. So the demon came to me one night when I was dreaming and tried to, break in. Khazar's head whipped around. You almost became an abomination? You never mentioned anything about that. He sounded hurt at not being told, and that made Jowen feel even more guilty for what came next. The blood mage swallowed. Well, Khazar hadn't torn him apart for the other thing, so maybe Jowen would survive this one. Besides, the elf had a right to know, better he be warned, for everyone's sakes. I couldn't fight him, he was far too strong. But I managed to talk him out of it. He was a pride demon, and as he was knocking me about the Fade, he mumbled about how I was weak, but he supposed I'd do. So I told him that I knew of a much stronger mage, one more befitting of such a strong demon. Khazar had gone very still. He was delighted, of course. He pressed me for more information, and offered to teach me blood magic to get me to my harrowing if I told him. And if I didn't, he said he'd take me over anyway and find this mage himself. So I made the deal. I had to, it was either that or die. Jowen fell quiet, rubbing the back of his hand as he waited Khazar's reaction. Khazar was quiet as he stared out over the lake. He was right at the entrance of my harrowing, like he was waiting for me. Like he knew. Khazar made a choked noise, then whipped his head around to glare fire at Jowen. You sicked a pride demon on me? Jowen tried to swallow. I panicked. You panicked. How is it that you panicking always ends up with me cleaning up your messes? By the veil, Jowen, you've got to be the worst friend ever. Khazar paced along the battlements, his hands waving furiously and occasionally emitting sparks. Damn it, Jowen, he found me. He was there at my harrowing, pretending to be a previously killed apprentice. Do you have any idea how lucky it is he didn't make a move in on me right then? If anyone could have defeated him, I figured it was you. Bullshit. Khazar whirled on him, fire flaring up his arms. He stuck a flaming finger at Jowen. You panicked, so you went and saved your own skin, just like you always do. And now a greater pride demon has apparently staked a claim on my soul, because you went and ran your mouth in your fear. Jowen paled. Staked a claim. Khazar threw his hands in the air and spun away. I'm like a demon buffet, apparently, but Mouse the demon you sent me, thank you again for that, is apparently so powerful that no others want to challenge him. How could you possibly know that? Jowen's world tilted as realization of something Khazar had said earlier hit him. Slowly, he asked, and how did you know that you need to make a deal with a demon to learn blood magic? Khazar went still and the magic around his hands dissipated into nothing. He was still turned away, so Jowen was left staring at his back in the starlight, panic clawing at his insides. The ritual. Connor's demon. Khazar, tell me you didn't. Please, tell me you didn't. Khazar spun back, eyes blazing. You're going to lecture me? You. But it wasn't a denial, and something in Jowen broke. Jowen sagged against the balustrade. This was all his fault somehow, everything was always somehow his fault. Do you have any idea what you've done? You'll never be free of it, now. It follows you everywhere, like whispers in the back of your mind, begging you to let the demons in. You think I haven't noticed? I can fight off a couple more nightmares. Not everyone is as weak as you, Khazar snapped, and Jowen winced, suddenly wondering whether the pride demon didn't have a foothold in the younger mage already. It's not about strength. I thought you knew this. You were strong enough without it, why would you need to even make the deal? You think this is easy, being a Grey Warden. Now Khazar was spiraling up into frantic and upset. Knowing I'm going to have to face an archdemon at some point, on top of the entire fucking horde. Lightning spun around the elf, wild and distressed. Marnan keeps saying that I'm going to be the linchpin that turns the entire damned blight. Do you have any idea how much fucking pressure that is? I'm a barely harrowed mage, not Androsta. The elf spun out toward the lake and let loose the energy that had been building up, and it launched through the air with a deafening crack of thunder, and the flash of lightning lit up the night for one blinding second. Jowan blinked, clearing his vision to see Khazar panting and leaning against the battlements, staring back out in the direction of the circle tower. They stared in silence for a while, 2 paces apart. Then, Khazar said, "Don't tell anybody." It wasn't quite a plea, but it was close enough to add a whole new layer of worry to this already rather stressful situation. "I won't." Khazar looked at him sharply, then nodded. He slumped down to the ground with a sigh, and Jowan wanted to do nothing but sit next to him and try to give any comfort he could. But whatever they'd used to have, it had never been comforting, and this thing they were now was far too fragile to tread new territory. So he stood a silent vigil while Khazar sat in the darkness, the weight of the world on his very small shoulders. And that, too, Khazar being pulled into the Wardens was all Jowan's fault. Perhaps it would be better to be dragged off to Eonar than to have to repay his only friend for all the wrong he'd done him. But even that, he knew, was the coward's way out. Jowan was so sick of being the coward. 70 Let your drunkard be your guide. This time was it, somehow Okaran just knew it. This was hardly the first time the warden had elbowed his way into the back room of Tapster's, seeking the peace and privacy of the back wall right near where Okaran liked to set his own camp. But this time, there was something different about the way the warden's eyes scanned over the crowd, and Okaran Sodding knew why the duster was there. He'd heard the rumors, it had only been a matter of time. Sure enough, the warden asked a brief question to a barmaid, who jerked a head back in Okaran's direction. The berserker hid his knowing grin in his mug. About sodding time. For a while there, he'd worried the kid would try to leave without him. The warden wove his way toward the back room, as usual, and his Cunary companion followed behind, as tall and stoic as ever. At some point, they'd lost that lady mage of theirs, more's the pity. The woman was a nice queen, from what Okaran had overheard, but by the stone was she some fine eye candy. And then the warden was standing over his table, staring down at him. "You Okaran?" "Yep," Okaran wanted to say. "The drunk you keep sitting next to is the guy you've needed all this time." "What are the odds, huh?" He settled for a simple yep. The warden cast a glance back at the Cunary, who grunted. Then, he kicked out a chair and sat in it, so the 2 dwarves were facing each other. "I'm Garot Broska, a Grey Warden dash." "I know who you are," Okaran said, setting his mug down. "By now, every nug in the city knows who you are. You're here about Branka, and it's about sodding time." The warden blinked, then smirked, and Okaran decided he kinda liked this guy's style. "You expecting me?" "Only for about a week, yeah." Okaran gestured to the barmaids for another round of drinks. This wasn't the sort of discussion he wanted with a cold belly, but then, few were. "Word is you're gathering supplies to strike out into the deep roads." "I'm comin' along." The Cunary spoke. "He would slow us down." "Slow you down nothin'. I'm the only one in this town who can show you the way." "Word is you got a drinking problem," the warden said dubiously. "Nah, it ain't a problem. Builds character. Trust me, I can find your paragon 3 sheets to the wind and with an ogre chewing on my arm." The warden sat back with a doubtful look. "You think you can find Branka? She's my wife, isn't she? She's got a special kind of crazy that only I've ever got inside. I know where she was headed, and I can follow her trail after that. You need me. Or," the warden rumbled with a slow smirk, "I could beat the information I want out of you and leave you here to drown in your cups. I'd like to see you try, kiddo." Okaran leaned forward over the table, matching the warden menacing grin for menacing grin. "You may be an ex-duster with a Cunary at your shoulder, but I'm a berserker whose amazing, gorgeous wife left him behind to wander the deep roads with a bunch of smiths. I'll cut the two of you into pieces before I even feel that little dagger of yours." And, much to Okaren's surprise, the warden threw his head back and roared with laughter. A frightened-looking barmaid placed the next round of drinks on the table, and the warden picked up a mug. "Sod it. You're hired." He raised the mug in toast, and Okaren tapped it with his own. The warden drained his mug like a pro, and Okaren figured they'd get along just fine. Check the description for the links to the author.